Dear colleagues, dear students, I'm very glad to welcome you today to this international workshop on the following topic: how social media changed the journalistic sphere, cross-cultural perspectives on the circulation of digital posts on news media websites. This workshop is a joint event common to the International Seminar on Social Media Discourse Analysis, ISSMDA, and to the Channels of Digital Scholarship Seminar, which is sponsored by Maison Française d'Oxford and Digital Scholarship at Oxford. I would first like to thank all my colleagues from ISSMDA and Channels of Digital Scholarship. I also want to thank Maison Française d'Oxford and its director, Pascal Marty, for his enduring support to the workshop. All my thanks also to my laboratory, l'ERMA, for its strong support. The topic chosen for this workshop today wants to highlight a specific trend. This trend is the following one. Traditional news media, called legacy media, have adopted a specific trend. They tend to show an increasing willingness to insert on their websites some digital posts that were initially published on social media. This means that one single digital post published by an artist or an athlete, for instance, can be quoted and shared by a quality paper or a magazine on their official websites. We thus notice a shift from an individual and isolated speech act on social media to the advertising of this post for a widespread audience on news media websites, which might elicit numerous comments from their readers. Our research topic today will focus on the endorsement of an individual's opinion and its circulation. It will investigate and analyze the different strategies implemented by news media websites to create articles, including embedded digital posts from social media. I want to give you some information about the format of today's workshop. We will have 5 papers. Each oral presentation will last approximately 30 minutes. And after each paper, you will be able to react and ask questions. During the Zoom workshop, I will ask you to mute your microphones during the talks. You could switch them on again if you want to ask questions. And you will be able to ask questions either by raising your virtual hands or by typing your questions in the chat window. Erin, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
So I will introduce you. I am very happy to welcome our first speaker, Erin McInerney. She is a PhD candidate in linguistics at the universities of Strasbourg and Glasgow. Her research primarily centers on the notion of Parisian discourse and analyzes how individuals make use of linguistic, semiotic, and platform-specific digital resources online to represent themselves and their habitus as Parisian. Her doctoral research investigates this discourse jar and language use more broadly at the Café de Flore Instagram geotag, from which she is building a new corpus of Instagram data for linguists and scholars in digital humanities. The contributions of her participants can be found on Instagram at Corpus de Flore. Her other areas of academic interest include online linguistic landscape and gendered representations of French identity in digital discourse. Erin is also an affiliated researcher at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, and department head for modern languages at the Strasbourg School of Architecture. In her research, Erin focuses on the reproduction of Instagram user-generated content by news media, and especially she analyzes how the online edition of Vogue recycles Instagram posts featuring the French girl archetype. Erin's talk today is entitled "Making Old News Newsworthy: The Instagram French Girl and the Perpetual Reconstruction of French Femininity in News Media." Erin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Grégoire. I'm going to go ahead and do the least interesting part of the talk, which is sharing my screen. So how's that looking for everyone?
Sounds good, yeah.
Looking great. All right. I ran this through earlier and my internet connection was a little unstable, so I do hope everything pans out. But if not, feel free to interject. All right, so thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be opening this session today with a look at this rather famous archetype that some of you undoubtedly know, but that we will nonetheless be revisiting today in a manner that I hope is interesting for you. So from shoulders to sandals, fringe to fingernails, denim to décolleté, French women have been mythologized to such great lengths that little is left to be said, but much is still yet to be imagined. Felicity Chapman has described the Parisienne as constituting what Ervin Penkovsky calls a type, because it possesses both a fixed and a fluid iconography, the fixed aspects being those necessary for any preliminary identification of the type, the fluid referring to the variations the type undergoes during its development. And this is something that we'll be carrying along with us today in this talk. However, I would also like to turn to Roland Barthes, who has spoken largely about the notion of the myth. I included the original French here, but for those of you who aren't French speakers, I will be providing a translation. So Barthes asks us, what is the purpose of a myth? What is the essence of a myth? It's about transforming meaning into form. In other words, myth is always a theft of language. In fact, perhaps the best weapon of myth is to mythologize it in turn, to produce an artificial myth. And this reconstituted myth will be a true mythology. Since myth steals from language, why not steal from myth? All we have to do is make myth itself the starting point of a third semiological chain and make its meaning the first term of a second myth. So in this spirit, I have devised two principal research questions that will be guiding our inquiry today. The first of which asks how content from the social media platform Instagram contributes to the discursive construction of the French girl trope when embedded in Vogue articles. And the second, which I will touch on just at the end, asks what similarities can be identified in these patterns of Parisian discourse, and to what extent this discourse genre resembles similar discourse that I've observed on the Instagram platform. So what can you expect from our brief time together today? First of all, I'll be asking who is this woman that we're spending so much time talking about and theorize her from a few different perspectives before moving on to the other theoretical underpinnings that frame this paper. The data and discussion will form the bulk of our time together before I conclude with some final thoughts. So who exactly is this woman? I suggest that popular literature divides this figure into three kind of concrete movements, the first of which is La Parisienne. So La Parisienne was largely constructed and elaborated by male Francophone writers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. The French woman, or Parisienne, was later commodified for an Anglophone audience by predominantly female writers in the late 20th and 21st century. And then the French girl, a predominantly 21st century neo-Parisienne's commodification, has largely been achieved through the work of female content creators or influencers working as contemporary wordsmiths in their performance of networked femininity. However, the initial rise of La Parisienne has often been associated with the success garnered by Rousseau's Julie or La Nouvelle Héloïse, following its publication in 1761. And although this was not the first attempt to paint a portrait of this figure, Rousseau's depiction established a foundation for other writers who set out to do the same in a nonfiction setting. And we have another quote here. So even if their characterization possesses a certain urbanity associated with all big cities, and which nourishes this opposition of Paris and surrounding areas, these have already been observed as belonging to women who are associated with the capital or the kingdom of France, who are outside of the norm, characterized by a concentration of richness, a strong population density, and industries of luxury, which we will come to see continues to imbue this figure today. These characteristics outlined by Rousseau and those who followed him also indicate how the Parisian had room to grow into other shoes and to be reinterpreted for particularly late 20th century American audiences who didn't resonate necessarily with figures' aristocratic overtones. This petit bourgeois distinction remains one of the distinguishing features that separates French and Anglophone iterations of the Parisian woman. So the Parisian had, of course, materialized as a transatlantic transport well before the late 20th century. The nouns parisien and parisienne are supposed to have first surfaced in the 15th century. The feminine form is believed to have made its way in English most prominently from the mid-19th century. It notably appears as an entry in Webster's dictionary in 1913. In 1912, she also emerged as the titular character in Octave Uzan's Les Parisiennes de nos temps, in the English version called the Modern Parisienne. And with the potential for consumption by a wider audience, this early translated literature was ideally posed to position, and I quote, this adorably feminine Parisienne as an ideological export for a specific cross-section of Anglophone society, those who possess the means to procure literature and those with the education to read it. So skipping ahead a few centuries, the 21st century saw a particular uptake in the consumption of this figure by Anglophone markets and her transformation from the singular Parisienne to this collective French women that you can see here on the screen. And this cast a greater ideological weight onto the collective notion of what it meant to be French and female for those outside of France. This woman was no longer a monolith, but a pattern of femininity sewn into French and no longer simply Parisian society. And while the stream of seemingly never-ending mediatization has not gone without retort from both Anglophone and Francophone actors, the connectivity patterns brought about by social media websites have provided a new opportunity for markets to repurpose and repackage this trope as the French girl. An ostensibly democratized reimagination of the figure, which lends herself ideally to networked societies, to the upwardly mobile, and to the offloading of conglomerate labor onto individual actors in often precarious economic positions. It is, in summary, a product of the male gaze that has been adopted and only very rarely co-opted by women. In both cases, she's mythologized specifically as a female figure with a sufficiently loose set of attributes so as to promote further mythologizing and specific inequalities so as to exclude the majority of the general population. These gatekeeping mechanisms ensure her continued vitality and success in social markets as a beacon of symbolic prestige. It's the intertwining of these three figures, but particularly of the strategies relative to their contemporary mediatization, that is of particular interest to my work. And as Olivier Dreux-Busset has suggested, what makes social media influencers particularly germane for sociocultural linguists is that their work depends centrally, but not exclusively, on the crafting of language. In this regard, social media influencers have emerged as a contemporary form of copywriters in a far wider political economy of people depending on language and communication, not only as a vehicle for their work, but also as the primary outcome of their work. Ultimately, this turn to wordsmiths is made in an effort to better map the wider political economy of language work and to consider how it is shaped by structures of privilege and inequality, by discourses of status and professionalism. So what I aim to relate to you with these examples is why we might associate the Parisienne with these multi-conglomerate LVMH-style corporations. In fact, the written word has had an extreme influence on the propagation of this monolith throughout our society. So as we turn to the theoretical underpinnings of this conversation, it may be evident by now that one of the key theoretical frameworks that I am adopting is that of mediatization. So I adopt a composite stance vis-a-vis this phenomenon that aligns with predominant work across sociolinguistic and social semiotic fields. Aga in 2011 has suggested that mediatization represents a process of commoditization upon a process of communication. Mediatization processes are indeed omnipresent in both societies afflicted by the neoliberal condition and in the literature that sets out to study them. And this is perhaps why Crispin Thurlow and Adam Jaworski have described mediatization as one of the most transformative processes in high modernity, along with globalization, urbanization, secularization, and individualization. Yanis Androtsopoulos has gone further to suggest that mediatization is the process by which an online-offline nexus emerges, and this is a nexus that specifically concerns this paper. But going further, he claims that a mediatized sign may be subject to commodification by those who do its mediatization and or the platforms that host the mediatization process. So mediatizing a landscape sign, Louise, I think your microphone is on. Means using digital affordances to capture, style, recontextualize, and disseminate a segment from an identifiable semiotic landscape, thereby enabling its uptake and evaluation by a networked audience. So two critical processes emerge from these definitions: circulation and commodification, both of which concern us today. But I'd also like to draw your attention to a third that's specifically relevant to the context of this paper, which is the anticipation that this audience is going to constitute a networked public. And I borrow from the definition put forward by Dana Boyd in 2010, where she states network publics are those that are restructured by networked technologies. They are simultaneously thus the space constructed through network technologies and the imagined collective that emerges as a result of the intersection of people, technology, and practice. And it's from this body of work that I've been theorizing the practice of networked femininity, which I define as the superimposition of typified gender performances, such as those proposed by Goffman, onto existing networked social practices to the point of enregisterment as a platform-specific discourse genre. And so when we talk about this enregisterment, what we're seeing are self-representation strategies that rely heavily on the reinterpretation of gendered social practices for networked economies. And here's a selection of literature that looks at this, notably through the lens of the selfie, which is the most enregistered practice that we could speak about specifically in my context on Instagram. So moving now to the data that frames this paper, and reminding you again just of those research questions now that we've walked our way through the theoretical aspects. This paper arose as a companion study to my principal research project, which Grégoire kindly mentioned in the introduction, which studies Parisian discourse on the social media platform Instagram. The project, which principally took place between the years of 2023, aimed to conceptualize how individuals represent the city of Paris and themselves whilst in Paris. So the study gathered 415 posts from the Café de Flore geotag, and that was every post that was tagged to the geotag on the first day of every month of the year 2022. So a total of 415 posts in the end. And I began looking outside of this specific site for data collection to contextualize some of the discursive themes that I was observing in the data. So those that I presented earlier, these networked phenomena, and especially the aspects of mediatization. And for that, I gathered a secondary data set from different related sources within the same frame. This included 3 geotags from the Netflix television series Emily in Paris, located in the 5th arrondissement. And for this paper, a selection of Vogue articles, which form today's corpus. So the corpus that I'm presenting today is a rather small corpus consisting of 10 articles. I didn't set out many qualifications because I was approaching this more from an inductive side. The qualifications were that I wanted them to be written by different authors so as not to have perhaps too much stylistic overlap. In their text body, they had to mention either French women, Parisians, or the French girl, not necessarily in the title, but as you can see, that tended to be the trend nonetheless. And to include some kind of content from Instagram. So that could be a linguistic reference to the platform or to a specific account, or more frequently, it was the use of semiotic material that was embedded into the article's copy or body. Articles for this paper ranged in length from quite small, 271 words, to 1,096 words, with an average of 607 words. So to answer the first research question that I've posed, I'd like to consider how these articles are discursively constructed apart from their semiotic content. While many of Vogue's articles are positioned both linguistically and visually as news media, or at least fashion news media, the majority of these articles adopt a highly casual register, resulting from a few concrete strategies. And these include a lack of hedging, wordplay, use of imperatives, and acts of off-the-cuff stance taking. The result of this is very much prescriptive language that masks itself as descriptive language. And you can see a few examples of these here from the selection of articles. The first comes from the title of this article that I've written here. Jisoo is also finding spiritual connection in the archetypical French girl aesthetic: marinière knits, slogan caps, and wide-leg trousers. So again, we see a kind of a very prescriptive idea of what these women will wear. She doesn't contour her face or watch Netflix or eat processed food. She just applies a light coating of lip balm and reads first edition Annie Ernaux books. And even with this little clin d'oeil, which is evidently coming from the author, we can still get this idea of a prescriptive notion of what the French girl or the Parisien is or isn't doing. I especially found this third extract quite interesting because it came from a set of interviews from typified French girl influencer types in living and working in Paris. And this individual commented, "It's complicated because I don't have the French girl hair type. I'm from Algeria, but I'm not French. Growing up, having curly hair was not on trend. It has been my biggest complex and insecurity. I used to straighten it all the time, which is why it's so damaged now." And so again, what really came out to me was in this attempt to provide descriptive language, we're really getting a lot of prescription about how this figure is or is not notably supposed to look. And finally, forget anything blunt cut or razor sharp. A perfectly square fringe is a dead giveaway that you're fresh from the salon. And that simply wouldn't be French. French girl beauty is all down to its deceptive laissez-faire approach. So what we observe here is that this prescriptive language and descriptive language is then strategically offset by the use of language that crafts this figure as something that is still elusive and unattainable. So striking quite an interesting balance. She does this, she doesn't do this, and yet very loose, unequivocal terms. Lexical tokens such as natural, everyday, simple, timeless, don't, real, and fresh, as well as multiple uses of the prefix un, such as undone and unhurried, recall language that's used in these longer form texts that I introduced earlier to elaborate the French feminine myth. Some of those titles, if you caught them, French children who are presumably mothered by French mothers don't throw food. French women don't get fat. French women don't get facelifts. And what we observe is a recapitulation across these texts of lexically homogeneous content and recycled discourse, but a reproduction of stereotyped discourse about Parisian and French women that spans languages, centuries, and cultures. Engrams were much less frequent in this corpus. Again, it was relatively small, but these were three of the most frequently used engrams: the French, in Paris, and the French girl. However, most striking was the use of French girl as an adjective rather than a noun, as you saw in many of these titles: French girl hair, French girl nails, which is attributing all of these visual characteristics to aligning with a certain archetype. So how then does Instagram content come to influence these articles? I noticed that Instagram content is employed really to systemically reinforce these regimes of homogeneity. We see these embodied performances featuring undone hair, fresh face makeup, natural glances, and ostensibly authentic poses, which are collated and used to create an image of timeless femininity. By integrating, however, the work of influencers and content creators, this fashion powerhouse, Vogue, which is published by Condé Nast, one of the most elite mass media corporations in America, which itself is owned by a privately held company, it positions itself as an everyday self-effacing actor in the industry, seeking to bolster the work of lesser-known fashion workers. But in reality, these semiotic and multimodal resources bolster the dynamism of Vogue's brand through increased web traffic gained from the use of networked systems, and offloads labors of creativity onto these so-called creatives, whose precarity from a gig economy is nonetheless tempered by the social prestige brought about by their capacity to dissolve into the Parisian form cut out by print media since the 17th century. So what then can be said about the parallels between this discourse, which co-opts Instagram content, and discourse that is generated specifically on and for the platform? So here I'll be providing you with a few samples from my corpus that I gathered in 2022. In both settings, French femininity is performed as having an intrinsic link to Paris. Paris is not so much personified in any of these representations, so much as depicted as a symbolic resource for the construction of an online-offline persona and the perpetuation of the myth first stated by Georges Montorgueil in 1897, one of the titles I put up for you in the earlier slides, that on ne devient parisien qu'à Paris. So we only become Parisian in Paris. We also notice how the feminine form, once this link with Paris is established, is put on display, reasserting that when we speak about Parisians, we're speaking specifically about women, but a certain type of woman, neo-bourgeois, white, cisgender, presumably heterosexual, able-bodied young women who are able to display nearly all of these qualities using the networked affordances offered by the platform so as to insert themselves and their personas into this discourse genre. And we see how these also align with frameworks proposed by Goffman in his understanding of gender performances. Feminine touch is used to highlight the props that are included in these photos. Body display is put forward prominently as the main element of this feature, and licensed withdrawal allows us to project a greater image or self-image onto these women and further democratize ostensibly this myth of the Parisian. So what final thoughts can we bring to this? As Goffman says, displays very often have a dialogic character of a statement reply kind, with an expression on the part of one individual, calling forth an expression on the part of another. And as this continued mediatization of stereotypical representations of French femininity contributes not only to the ensured vitality of the monolith, its enregistrement becomes a cultural norm, particularly for those living outside of the country. Returning to Barthes, what we can see in this data is an eternal push and pull, an eternal dialogic statement and reply between myth and language, between news media and social media, and between mediatization and the platformization of our everyday lives, which is in no likelihood about to slow down anytime soon. So I finished a little bit early because I talked quickly, but I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I welcome any thoughts or questions.
Thank you very much, Erin, for your brilliant presentation. It was very rich, and I'm sure it will generate a lot of questions. So if you have questions, you can raise your hands or ask questions in the chat. Who wants to start? I will start with a question.
That's all right. I might have talked too quickly.
How did you select actually the different articles you mentioned today, the 10 articles from Vogue?
So as I said, I had just a few qualifications because of that more inductive approach. I wanted to see what was coming out in that discourse. So I just looked for it to have at least one instance of the word Parisienne, or French girl in the body of the article, so not necessarily in the title. And I wanted it to have incorporated some type of Instagram content, whether that's just a mention to an Instagram account or the use of semiotic material in the body of the article. And it was most frequently the second. And then the third qualification was that I wanted a corpus from different authors. So in fact, there was a lot of material to work with, but often similar authors writing the same type of article. So repurposing and recycling their own discourse about the subject. And I wanted to get as much of a variety as possible. And then I set it out within the same time frame that I collected my data from Instagram. So anywhere between, or that I was working on the project. So anywhere between 2021 and 2023.
Okay, thank you. So we have two questions. Camilla, can you ask your question?
Oh, wait, Jason. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Erin, thank you for the brilliant presentation. I'm really interested in that subject as well, especially because I have been a teacher for 25 years, mostly working with teens, and I have two young girls, adult girls. So I'm also interested in the reaction of the posts. Do you see any reaction? Do you ever look at the reactions? And do you see how that might impact the users, the consumers of that kind of discourse?
Yes, thank you very much for your question, Camilla. So I suppose I group these posts into the two categories. So the ones used by Vogue and then the ones I gathered for my project on the side. The ones used by Vogue are people who could be defined very much as influencers or micro celebrities. So the engagement with those posts is significantly higher. Whereas in my corpus, I had a range of contributors. I very much had individuals with a small following or individuals with a larger following who could very much be considered influencers. I looked at the engagement out of sheer curiosity in my post, but one of the things that I didn't collect were comments or numbers of likes because I did all of my data collection manually so as not to mess with Instagram's quite stringent restrictions when it comes to data collection. So I didn't gather any metadata associated with that. Nor have I compared it against, say, a set of Instagram data that is not associated with a highly intrinsic Parisian location. However, that's sort of one of the aims of these side projects, is to contextualize it somehow. For example, Café de Flore, which is also figured in the Emily in Paris series, there were much fewer references to Emily in Paris at Café de Flore than there were at the 3 other geotags I studied for my side project. So there definitely are differences in the data, but I would say the principal the principal lines of discourse or even lexical features happening are the same, and they tend to elicit, I would say, a fair amount of engagement on the platform, but perhaps difficult to say with any real certainty without a kind of control data set.
Thank you very much.
In the chat, Benedict has asked a question, but I can no longer see her post. So if you please ask the question again. We will take Svetlana's question first.
So does the fact that now mostly women generate content connected to the concept, that this concept is free of the male gaze position? Thank you. Really interesting comment from Svetlana. So one of the things that, really interested me as I dove further into the history of this is the fact that it was obviously, and not surprisingly, given the time and given access to education and rights to work and publishing, generated by male figures. I was very interested that this discourse was very much co-opted by women for other women beginning in the late 21st century. And so it took on a different approach. However, now in this return to a more individualistic, so shifting from the Parisienne to French women to the French girl, we've gone back to a more individualistic idea. And I certainly don't think that it's free of the male gaze position. If you notice on one of the data samples, it was written under the caption, "My husband understood the assignment," when she was pictured in front of the Café de Flore. And so not only does it imply that there is an unspoken position or framing to adopt in these photos, but often the person pictured in front of the camera is not the one behind the camera. And so very much it could be literally from the male gaze, literally from the guy taking the photo if it's mentioned. But I definitely believe that this performance of femininity, while it's not geared exclusively towards men, still continues to maintain these things that Goffman pointed out, which were very much in the gender advertisements in the 70s for a dominant male audience. So let's say those kind of set the blueprint for what it is to advertise one's self. And now this networked femininity is just making it more complicated or more complex, I would say, which is that the audience is not necessarily clear cut, but I certainly wouldn't rule out the idea of that influence. I think it's absolutely ubiquitous and absolutely critical to how it's constructed today.
We have a second question by Merlin in the chat.
All right, so Merlin Kim, I have a question regarding the possible stereotype of the white Parisian woman. Have you encountered in your research and your data collection other identities being represented as well, other ethnicities, body abilities, gender display? And if so, do you have any specific interpretations regarding these? And do they somewhat fit into an appropriation role? Sorry for being so wordy, no problem. So I did attempt to demonstrate very loosely some of the diversity that I found in the Vogue corpus and in my corpus, which is to say there wasn't a lot. It was very much just kind of sprinkled through. And when I talk about diversity, I talk largely about racial diversity. So there were contributions from races other than white women. However, white women were absolutely the predominant contributors to my corpus and to the Vogue corpus. In terms of able-bodied people, I've seen absolutely no images of disabled persons or otherly abled persons, no talk of neurodivergence or disabilities that aren't physical or can't be seen. It very much, when I talk about discourses of homogeneity, this is also what I'm talking about. Dominant social discourses, which tend to overlook traditionally marginalized groups, absolutely have found their home on Instagram and in Vogue in these representations. And that is why as well, even though I talk about this ostensible democratization of the myth or the trope, we continue to see a recycling of exactly what was theorized or brought about in the 18th century, which certainly left no room for any type of diversity whatsoever. So yes, while some women, perhaps, so Black women, Indian women, or those were the two principal contributors to my corpus that were not white, are taking the opportunity to reclaim this. My interpretations would be that, at least for my corpus, the travel to France, this idea that one can only become Parisian in Paris, requires not only a kind of upwardly mobile person, but a mobile person, which itself represents privilege to move around, privilege to be able to travel, to bring oneself to Paris, to take the days off of work. And so you already have to meet quite a long list of criteria that deal with that type of privilege before you can ever represent yourself as that type of person in that space.
Thank you. Are there any questions either in the chat or online with virtual hands?
Thank you. Thank you, Merlin, for your question, and Svetlana and Camilla, everyone else for your questions as well.
I have a question on the way you collected these posts, for instance, especially those posts from Instagram. Did you use a special tool to do so, or because as multimodality is involved, I would like to know how you managed to collect these posts.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a long-winded process, but I really enjoy talking about it because I do. So if you saw any contributions from my corpus today, those are all individuals who have agreed to lend their work to my work. And so today I took more of a critical approach. I noticed, I mean, in the abstract, I've written that I use critical discourse analysis for this particular aspect of the study, which I did. But one of my aims as well was to kind of challenge that urge to go straight to critique, and use some of the other frameworks that have been theorized in feminist media studies, including one by a woman named Crystal Abadan, who talks about subversive frivolity. And I quite like that concept. So I don't always take a critical approach in kind of both senses to analyzing this. But all that to say, these people have lent their content to my work, and all of the content was gathered manually. So as a first step, I actually grouped all of the content using Instagram-specific platform resources, which is the Save and Collections feature. So I gathered all of the content, grouped it by month within the platform, and then analyzed it for a year before ever extracting it from the platform, allowing the dataset to evolve, post to change, post to be removed from the platform. And only after the year was completed did I extract it from the platform, once again manually. So I used screenshots and screen recordings. And then that data I used in the in vivo tool for my qualitative analysis. And then to share the data, I then either re-upload those with the permission of the users to the dedicated Instagram account I've created for the corpus, or I'm actually playing with another kind of diffusion tool that's also on Instagram, because my desire was to preserve as many of these multimodal features and to avoid this continuous resemiotization and textualization processes that, as Riccadima says, who theorized resemiotization, it increasingly divorces it from its original context. So my goal after the analysis was always to keep it as close to the original source as possible. So that's why I didn't use any scraping tools, and why I'm not uploading it to an external server for viewing, but trying to host as much of the data on the original platform as possible.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I please repeat the name of the tool? Well, there was no tool apart from In Vivo, which was the software I used to analyze. And then I imported photos and videos to that, and you can code them as you would do any kind of qualitative coding. It's quite a useful tool, and it starts with N. I've put it in the chat like that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
That's all right. No, I don't,
Yeah.
don't want to force anyone to ask questions. So,
So I will thank you once again for your presentation. Thank you very much.
thank
Erin.
you very much, and looking forward to seeing the other presentations today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. André, are you ready?
I am. Thank you, Grégoire.
Good. So I will introduce our second speaker. André Goes is a lecturer in the Department of Languages and Social Sciences at Academia in Centurion. Before joining higher education, he was involved with various media institutions in South Africa for more than 2 decades. This includes Build, Der Burger, and Graphics 24, Media 24's infographics department. He was the founding editor of Graphics 24 and filled several other editorial positions at Media 24, including night editor and chief sub-editor of Der Burger. He has been in higher education since 2017. He taught journalism at Stellenbosch University for 2 years and journalism and communication at Northwest University in Potchefstroom for 4 years until February 2022. He joined Academia in March 2023, so very recently, where his teaching specialties are digital and visual journalism. André is a research fellow at Northwest University. His research interests are in digital journalism with a strong focus on peripheral journalism. Peripheral journalism refers to journalistic work being performed in the digital environment by people on the boundaries of legacy journalism. He has a keen interest in pedagogical innovations at different institutions of higher learning, and he's constantly striving to develop and adapt his own teaching methods to remain relevant in the digital era. In 2022, he received the Teaching Excellence Award from Northwest University, Faculty of Humanities, for excellence in teaching in the School of Communication. And 2 years ago, he received the Teaching Excellence Award from Northwest University for the use of information technology in teaching. He holds an MA in Journalism and Media Studies from Rhodes University, and he's currently completing his PhD at Stellenbosch University. His PhD is a boundary study exploring the emergence of a new type of digital public sphere on Facebook groups about Potchefstroom. André will focus today on a conceptual argument about the emergence of a new type of online public sphere through social media, which does not appear to function as part of the traditional journalistic public sphere. His presentation today is entitled "The Creation of a New Type of Public Sphere by Journalistic Boundary Workers." André, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Grégoire, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Yes, I come from the discipline of journalism, so my presentation is perhaps a slightly different perspective to the others here today. I am going to present my argument for the emergence of a new type of public sphere, which in effect means that much of the public sphere conversation now actually happens outside legacy media. So there's something has been created that is and functions as a public sphere, but it's no longer run by legacy media. So let me just share my screen. I just want to, maybe by way of introduction, as you also said now when you introduced me, I am a journalism scholar, so journalism lies close to my heart. That is what I do. But the questions that I ask in this presentation and in my PhD work are very uncomfortable and fundamental questions that go to the core of journalism, because journalism is changing so much and its roles and functions are changing so much that we really need to, it's difficult to ask these questions, but we need to ask what journalism is going to look like in a number of years and how it is changing, because we cannot deny the fact that it is, and specifically its public sphere role as well, is changing considerably from what it used to be. So the content of my presentation today, I will discuss my research question, my theoretical approaches, then I'll give you some context just about journalism and its challenges, because I think that is important to understand where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to talk about how we need to reassess journalism and its roles, including its public sphere role, and how journalism cannot be seen as a fixed institution anymore. Then I will discuss the public sphere and journalism, a theoretical approach called the radical audience turn in journalism, where we look at the audience role in the public sphere from the audience perspective only. And then I will provide some recent scholarly and a couple of anecdotal examples. My own study has not reached the stage of empirical analysis yet, so I'm presenting merely my conceptual argument today, and then some other examples that are relatively similar to what I am doing. So let's start with this quote, which is an important quote, I think, in the digital environment where we work now. Anyone with access to the internet can partake in digital journalism. It is no longer just journalists who do journalism. And this one, which comes from the Handbook of Journalism Studies, one of our seminal works in our field, in my discipline, journalism as an object of research has been destabilized. Key concepts: who is a journalist? What is journalism? They are now subject to constant challenge and contestations. And this will continue because of all the technological changes we are seeing. But this will lead to more diversification in journalism and eventually to a greater multiplicity of research traditions, which I think is a good thing. So my research question: what is the nature of the digital public sphere that is emerging on the boundaries of journalism as facilitated by Facebook pages about Potchefstroom? I'm doing an ethnography, which is an online first type of ethnography. That's a whole presentation in itself. It's a very interesting methodology. I am approaching my study by not relying on assumptions about the hegemony of legacy media and the clear divide between journalists and their audiences. Because these normative frameworks are rooted in the global North's perspective of what journalism is, which is often relies on journalism as the protector of democracy. And that is no longer a sufficient framework for us to examine journalism in the digital age. So the study explores the emergence of a new type of public sphere online. It's a qualitative study and ethnography, as I said. Briefly, the theoretical approaches I'm looking at. In the journalism literature, there are many scholars who argue that we do need a new, clear theoretical framework to examine the work of these peripheral actors. Anish and Lohman, they have this list of dimensions that we can use to help us determine what type of work these peripheral actors are doing. These are identities, practices, structures. So identities, that means, are they journalists? Are they peripheral actors? Are they ordinary people? Are they citizens? Practices, that's what they do. Do they create what we may see as news? Do they create public sphere deliberation, even though they are not journalists? And structures refer to where it is being done, which is social media. There is also Matt Carlson, who created this framework for boundary work. Boundary work can be used in any kind of study of any profession. It has to do with where the professionals or those inside the boundaries try to protect their boundaries. So there are three terms here that we can use, namely expansion, expulsion, and protection of autonomy. As boundaries change, as people start doing things that are similar to what the professionals or the craftsmen used to do, we can explore how these professionals experience this by expanding their boundaries. So in other words, accepting these peripheral actors as part of their field, or by pushing them away, which is expulsion, and then protection of autonomy by really drawing the line and saying, we don't want you here. Which is unfortunately what is still happening a bit in journalism. And then I look at public sphere theories, and all of this in the context of the radical audience turning journalism. So I'll run through these slides just as context, but it is a well-known fact that legacy media around the world are really struggling. Legacy media are losing influence. There are questions about financing journalism. Professional journalism has really disappeared from small communities around the world, which is a very big problem. And this is exactly where the peripheral actors started coming in. So for too long, journalism has been imagined as an institution perched in pristine isolation from its surroundings. It's not like that anymore. Journalism is not separated from everything that is happening around it and in the digital field specifically. Some figures, I'll just mention the South African figures, which is where I am and which is also what motivated my study. Legacy media really have lost the influence they once had. Our biggest newspaper is the Sunday Times. At its prime, it had a circulation of about 500,000. It's now about 93,000. So we can see the effect of what is happening. And those people who do not read the printed newspapers anymore, they also don't read the online sites anymore. They simply just move away from news and they find their news elsewhere. Part of the reason is the fact that legacy media have moved away from small towns. So there's no, because my study focuses on a small town, it's very hyper-local. So local news, local issues, it's no longer on the agenda. The public sphere in these areas simply do not provide any value to people who live there. And that's why people started doing it themselves. So social media, it's one of the factors why this has changed. Social media and the digital environment is one of the reasons why people have just started leaving legacy media and they find their news elsewhere, their information. So journalism no longer is this autonomous, permanent, institutionalized institution in the world. It's not the current reality. And journalism's efforts to enforce this exclusivity of what it does, it's also no longer working. So we need to move beyond this over-reliance on journalism as an inherently stable institution and reassess journalism's normative role in society, and in particular the public sphere role. Because as I said now in my context, journalism no longer provides that in many areas. Here, where I am in the global south in South Africa, definitely not. So these are some of the normative functions of journalism. I think we are all mostly aware of most of these. This one is important. It helps society function. But because they are gone now, these peripheral actors are taking the place. So if we start examining the roles of peripheral actors in journalism, we will develop new understandings of journalism, which we need to do in the digital era where legacy media are losing their influence. So peripheral journalism is just, this is from scholars, Zimbabwean scholars. It's a type of storytelling that is conducted by people who are not associated with the codified, institutionalized, routinized practices known as journalism. They are seen as interlopers, strangers, uninvited guests, gatecrashers. They have no training. They're not hamstrung by the ethical journalistic baggage, which is a bit of an issue. They don't adhere to formulaic writing or packaging of content. They tell stories using available technology. In Africa, things like pavement radio, but websites, mobile phones, blogs, mobile instant messaging apps, and social media particularly. And so one can see why many scholars fear this actually, because this is well beyond what we see journalism to be. And that's why there are two strands in our research: people who want to protect the institution of journalism, and then those who want to extend the boundaries. And the protectors constantly rely on this argument of journalism as a protector of democracy. I think we all know, we are all very familiar with this. When you read many news media globally, I'm thinking of The Guardian as one example, you'll constantly get a message: we protect democracy, sign up, give us some money. The same thing happens here with our South African news media. But this is not all that journalism does. Journalism can be a lot more than this. And many scholars in recent years have begun to realize this, that we should stop focusing on this journalism. We need journalism to protect democracy. And we should start looking at all the other things that journalism can do. And the problem with that argument also about journalism protecting democracy is there is journalism in authoritarian states, which we conveniently forget. But there is journalism in China, for example, very big journalism. And it does provide a certain function to society. So we need to start thinking in different ways there. So journalism has mostly been approached from this liberal, Western liberal democratic viewpoint from the West, which, as I just said now, it doesn't take into context what is happening in the global South, what is happening in other places. That is also one reason why peripheral actors are starting to rise and just doing things in their own way. And this specifically happens on social media. So here, these peripheral actors, which are the audience, in the literature they still called the audience, but that term in itself is problematic because that implies they are recipients, but they are not only recipients now, they are also the senders of the messages. So that is something that needs some reconceptualization as well, but that is the term being used in the literature, so that is a term I'm still using in my study. But the reality shows us that Facebook is 56%, 55% of people in Africa use Facebook for their news. YouTube is getting bigger. 68% of people in South Africa find their news on social media, and that's where they participate in discussions. That's where they participate in the public sphere deliberation. These are significant numbers, which we need to accept the reality of that. I'm going to skip that slide. So when we get to the journalistic public sphere, all of that as background, why we need to look at what is going on now digitally and by these peripheral actors. This definition of Habermas, it's this realm of our social life where we have access for everyone. It comes into being when we have conversations in a public body. They behave not like business or professional people, but like members of a constitutional order subject to the legal constraints of, nor like members of a constitutional order subject to the legal constraints. They behave as a public body when they confer in an unrestricted fashion with the guarantee of freedom of assembly and association and the freedom to express and publish their opinions. If we just look at this objectively, all of this is happening on social media already. But scholars do not view that as a type of journalistic public sphere yet. So there is much argumentation for reconceptualizing the public sphere in the digital age. The journal Communication Theory has just had a special issue in May 2023, so it's brand new, where Eisenegger and Schaeffer provide these 9 theses that the public sphere is still there, but it's mostly theorizing. It's used, but with, this is now as a theoretical foundation, it's used, but with many gaps, still Western-centric. Habermas is losing influence, still seen as valid, is also a function. They did a study of all the works from the 1990s to 2023 to see, in journalism now, and in communication study, to see when and where the public sphere theory is mentioned. There's some focus on non-Western public sphere theories, but these are quite relevant to my argument and to my study, that there's no unified public sphere. The digital era has created these multiple public spheres, which can be international, national, local, and hyperlocal. And there's a shift from the situational, which is the media, the legacy media, to a ubiquitous public sphere, which is social media, where anyone at any time can contribute and participate in public deliberation. So the infrastructure is changing. That's also one of the theses that they found in studies that have been done. There's a weakening of the established intermediaries, the legacy media again, and the strengthening of the new platforms where the deliberation now happens. And then a somewhat scary one, AI may once again change all our understandings of the public sphere, but this is so new that no studies have been done about that really. So legacy media used to be the place that was seen as the mediators of public sphere deliberation. But it's no longer the case. We need to, it was very normative, it was very prescriptive. Now public deliberation happens in many different ways and on many different platforms, but mostly social media. So the time is now to question our assumptions of the public sphere and how it should function, because on the social media, it operates differently. We have always contested the public sphere theory anyway, so it's just time to recontest it somehow. So what is happening now is that audiences who have been excluded from journalism studies for a very long time, they've been studied, but always from a producer-orientated side, like how do the audience help the media? Never actually looking at, from the audience's perspective, what do the audience want? What are the audience doing? Are the audience acting as active agents by themselves, irrespective of what's happening in legacy media? So Hendricks Swart et al. And Costera Meyer, these are some of the most well-known scholars who argue now for this thing, that we need to look at audiences from their own perspective. We don't necessarily need to look at it from the lens of the legacy media, but these audiences might be doing journalism just in a slightly different ways. So there are fears that this will lead to popularization, sensationalism. Quality journalism is often used as the argument to protect the boundaries around journalism. But the radical audience turn asks us to really start looking at the public sphere from the audience perspective, from what the audience wants. So audiences are filling the gaps left by legacy media. They are creating already public sphere deliberation in many, many ways. I want to move to, because my time is running out, to some examples. So there's social media activism is one of the examples that we've seen a lot. Arab Spring, for example, in South Africa, we had the Rose Must Fall movement, which spread all around the world. It went up to Oxford. It became such a big movement globally. So the Global South provides us a way of looking, an opportunity of looking at these new ways of doing journalism. And then briefly, audiences are more sophisticated than we think, because this is also often an argument for how can we trust the audience to mediate a public sphere by themselves, because there's fake news, there's disinformation. But many studies have found that audiences are actually able to mediate, to discuss issues and concerns in a mediated way. So it does happen. I want to move away from those and provide quick examples. There's this one in Zimbabwe. It's an organization called the Center for Innovation and Technology in Bulawayo. They're on social media sites. A study found that they have a very clear digital public sphere, even though that wasn't the purpose. It turned out that people would start discussing, because this is an arts and activism page, but it became a page where people would deliberate on public sphere issues. Diasporic communities from Zimbabwe as well have been found to create where they move to, because the legacy media there do not represent them. So they create their own digital counter-publics on Facebook with examples of the public sphere. The coronavirus pandemic provided many examples of these mini public spheres discussing this. And one quick recent anecdotal example, this is very interesting. And this one, to a certain extent, illustrates how these discussions do not necessarily need to reach the mainstream media to become a public sphere discussion. In South Africa, the word colored is the word that is used for mixed race people. And Trevor Noah posted, everyone knows Trevor Noah, posted something about being colored on his Twitter site. And it turned into a very big, very long discussion that really, here in South Africa, people spoke about it in the corridors, at work, at the gym. But the legacy media did not cover this. Only this one article on a completely unknown website is the one that I found. But it became a real public issue of concern that was deliberated. What does colored mean? What does mixed race mean between South Africans and between Americans? This to me is a very clear example of how people created their own public sphere deliberation for the lack of legacy media taking that up. I want to move to my summary. Grégoire, I'm right, my time is almost up.
You have plenty of time left, no problem.
Do I still have time left? My timer says... Oh, I do.
Yeah. You have 10 more minutes.
Okay, let me then go back to this one. Here's another example, which is just this morning that I picked up that I found very, very interesting. The election in Argentina, there's this group called Swifties against changing democracy. They've got like a strange term that they call themselves. I think that's a Spanish but those are Spanish words. But they posted about the Argentinian presidential candidate, Javier Milei, and how he is presenting a danger to freedom and to human rights. And you can see this was posted yesterday only. It was unfortunately on my screen, it's cut off now. It was viewed just over 1 million times, already almost 1,000 comments. Clear example to me, on social media, people are creating an important public sphere discussion with no intervention from legacy media. There are many examples like this. So I'll discuss this one also. This is just an anecdotal example as well. This is when I was teaching in Potchefstroom. I'm showing the road because it is about roads. My students there had a news website as part of their studies. And potholes is an issue, a very big issue in Potchefstroom. So they created this map that they posted on social media and also on their website. It was immediately taken up by various other Facebook groups in Potchefstroom, which are the groups that I'm actually studying now in my PhD to explore the emergence of the public sphere. This is where I got the idea for my study from. It went viral, basically. And then, I know this is anecdotal, no real study was done about this, but then all the students started noticing that in their areas and their suburbs, suddenly the municipality started fixing potholes. So to me, this was a very, very good example of ordinary people, citizens, putting an issue on the public agenda on social media and actually influencing public policy, influencing the municipality in some way to do something, which to me shows that it does, it does have an effect. So some of the questions that I am considering in my study and maybe in future studies is how can we define this new type of public sphere that does what the journalistic public sphere did? Because as I explained, this is not a public sphere that is mediated by journalists now. It functions to an extent in the way that the journalistic public sphere did. It seems to have the same effect. It puts issues on the public agenda. It's a way for society to be ordered, which is also one of the functions of the public sphere. But ordinary people do it. So how are we going to define this? Which is the big question that I'm exploring in my PhD. So we can look at how this public sphere helps citizens to make informed decisions about their daily life, how they are participating in meaningful discussions, how they place important topics on the agenda. And an important question, as some of the examples that I've shown now, when these topics are on the agenda and only on social media, do we count them now as being on the agenda? Do they need to reach legacy media? Because if we consider that legacy media is no longer as strong as they used to be, and no longer have the influence that they used to have, perhaps that public sphere deliberation has moved entirely or to a very great extent to social media. And we should start examining that from the perspective of journalism, from the perspective of these people are doing what the journalists used to do. And then that other question, do these deliberations inform the public debate, public policy, also one to consider. So my summary, I think we need to redefine journalism. The changes in the digital era makes this inevitable. Our audiences have more agency and more sophisticated skills now when negotiating news and deliberating online than we give them credit for. There are enough studies already that show that audiences do mediate them one another, do participate in sensible discussions in a well-ordered way. Of course, there are always exceptions, and it's not always the case, but there's enough evidence already to show that it does happen. So audiences are replacing journalists in locations where legacy media are absent. They do mediate public sphere deliberation by themselves. These deliberations do seem to affect politics, daily life, formation of opinion, activism, and it's the public now who run this new public sphere. And this public, we can define them as the audience or as peripheral actors, but it is perhaps possible or necessary to consider, here's my recommendations, to integrate these peripheral actors into journalism and journalism studies. So if there is a public sphere discussion, what seems to be a public sphere discussion on Facebook about an important topic, we can examine that from a journalism perspective, because that seems to be the work that they do. So my recommendations, we need to, in terms of research, I think we need to continue rethinking our conceptualization of the public sphere and how it operates in the digital space. We need to empower the audience through our research. That is something that journalism scholars have neglected for a very long time, and I think it is time for us to think about empowering them. It does influence how we think about how we teach journalism, because if we once taught journalism for journalists to start working at legacy media, we should think about now teaching journalism to students who will practice journalism without actually joining legacy media, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram. A very famous American broadcast announcer, I forgot his name now, once said that journalism is a skill that everyone needs. It's a kind of a skill for life. And I think now in the digital environment, it becomes even more important. So it's important for us to understand how journalism is changing and how the public sphere is changing. I will end with this quote from Hermida. For journalism scholars, for us, moving beyond the existential angst about where journalism is going, what is happening with journalism, involves making peace with the blurred and porous boundaries between newsmaker, news reporter, news consumer, and news distributor. It demands a degree of reflexivity by journalists, going beyond new journalistic practices, and it needs to address the strongly held beliefs of what it means to be a journalist. So it demands embracing a mindset that engages with the logics of the new media spaces, that responds to the changing information routines and audience practices, and embraces the wide gamut of forces involved in the production, dissemination, and circulation of news and information. And just some of my references. There we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andre, for your very rich presentation. And you have just shown us how journalism has been altered by the fact that actually peripheral actors have changed the way journalists work. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions after your presentation. Erin?
Okay, thank you, Andre, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious, so you were asking, one of the critical questions you were asking is how we should describe this evolving public sphere or the new media public sphere. And one of my questions for you is, to what extent you think this term public sphere should be so porous? Because I think we could argue, especially if we consider the social media aspect, that it's really getting pushed beyond how Habermas theorized it as a really bottom-up process. When we think about social media, it's bottom-up discourse, but that is disseminated based on top-down interests and based on algorithms. And those algorithms sort, determine, and order that discourse in a way that discourse actors have virtually no control over. And so I wonder if this is not a significant enough phenomenon to merit a different term. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Once I actually start with my empirical analysis, I will be able to answer the second part of your question, I think, a little bit better about the algorithms, because I do think that when people join Facebook groups, because I'm examining specifically Facebook groups, so I think then people automatically, I think the algorithm does pull them into that group, into those discussions quite often. So I'm really not looking at just on a wide basis according to hashtags. I'm looking at what happens within each specific group. Okay, so I think that might, I will have to see how that turns up. But the public sphere in the digital environment has been theorized in my field in journalism quite a bit. So there are various definitions that have been theorized already. One is the popular one is this idea of sphericals or little spheres by Bruns and others. I think despite the algorithms and despite the big corporations running it, I think there is a sense developing that there is still some kind of free conversation and open discussion happening. Because we must remember that legacy media was also never unfiltered. Your public sphere discussion in legacy media would have been filtered according to the political views of the newspaper, for example. Your public sphere discussion in the Guardian's letters page will be quite different from what happens in the Times letters page. So the filtering has always been there. It's just different now, but it's always been there. There's some argument that it is a little bit freer online because the access is easier and more open. But it's a good question, and I don't have a simple answer for you on that one.
Thank you. And if I could just say one final thing, and I'll leave it to Manuel. I think also when I'm talking about algorithms, I'm not so much talking about filtering so much as sorting. But when you talk about filtering, we can also talk about censorship. And I think those are the censorship that happens on some of these online platforms is quite salient, much perhaps more so than in some print media. But those are just my thoughts from a social media background. So thank you very much again for your presentation and for your response.
Thank you.
Thank you. Manuel has a question.
Well, thank you, André, for your interesting presentation. You actually spoke about the existence of journalism in China, and you said that it does serve society. I know that, I personally know that social networks are kind of restricted, so especially Facebook. So how does journalists serve the Chinese society?
Yes, when taken from the perspective of the traditional Western liberal view of journalism as protector of democracy, it does not serve society, clearly, because it's not a democratic state. But many of the arguments I presented today and arguments that are being presented more and more in the literature is that journalism is more than that. So journalism is about making informed decisions about your daily life, about knowing about basic events and things that happen in your area around you. So in that respect, journalism in pretty much any country, even in North Korea, serves society to a certain extent. But of course, it does not correspond to the traditional normative understanding of what journalism should be.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much.
I think there is a comment in the chat from Merlin.
I see it's in Afrikaans, my language. Is it a question or a comment?
Yeah, both, I think.
All right, let me just see. Oh, I see. It's fellow South African in South Afrikaans. Thank you, Merlin, for the question. So the question is, does my research point to an evolution of journalism and its presence in media toward a more town square format, as opposed to an article and reactions format? I would say so, yes. As I said already, I have not yet completed my own empirical part of my PhD, but the scholarly work that I rely on so far, and particularly in the African context, there's a lot of work that has been done in Zimbabwe, interestingly. Less so in South Africa, but quite a lot of work from Zimbabwean scholars, which to some extent maybe has some similarities to us. They found that it really is a kind of a town square format. So it really becomes a space where people will congregate online, where people will congregate, participate in conversation, in deliberation, formulate public opinion, because these are also things that the public sphere need to do, and sort of help order that society on a very hyper-local level. So I definitely think it is happening. I think that is one of the advantages of this type of public sphere. Because we must remember that the journalistic public sphere has always been somewhat exclusive. It never represented everyone. You at least had to have money to buy the newspaper. which now is even more difficult because newspapers have become very, very expensive. Or you need to go beyond the paywall. You need to sign up and pay a monthly fee, which in our context in South Africa, very, very few people can afford to do. So these deliberations are moving elsewhere. Thank you, Merlin, for the question.
Thank you. Is there another question before we move to Manel's presentation? So thank you once again. Maybe you wanted to ask something.
No, I noticed there's no more questions. So I just wanted to say thank you and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to introduce Manel Salem, who is a temporary teaching and research associate at Sorbonne Paris-Nord University. As a PhD graduate in Anglophone Studies, she is a member of the Pleiad Research Center with 2 research focuses: circulations, mobilities, and heritage from the one hand, and mobility, individual, and society from the other hand. In her research, she shows how social media changed the traditional journalistic public sphere thanks to the Arab Revolution, which is regarded as a case study. Her paper today is entitled "Breaking Barriers and Building Synergy: How Social Media Changed the Game for Traditional News Media in the Arab World During and After the Arab Revolution." We're listening to you, Manel.
All right. You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right.
Perfectly.
Thank you. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity, to present my paper today, which is actually about the importance of social media in the Arab world and the role that they actually play in making these revolutions take place in the Arab world. And my questions will be about the extent to which social media actually can contribute to the outbreak of revolutions in Arab countries, mainly Tunisia, the country I come from, and also Egypt. And also, to what extent do they actually, or were they a way to achieve democracy and freedom of expression for all? So I would first speak about pre-revolutionary situation in Tunisia, and then speak about social media as a catalyst to the revolutionary movement that took place in Tunisia. Then I would also speak about the revolutionary era in Egypt, and then the youth leaders that actually led to the overthrow of the authoritarian regime in Egypt. All right. So the Arab Spring, which consisted of a series of pro-democracy uprisings and protests that occurred across the Arab world, starting from 2010, from end 2010 to early 2011, was marked by the significant use of the internet and social media to mobilize, communicate, disseminate information. Traditional media outlets in many of these countries were often tightly controlled or censored by the government, making digital communication platforms a crucial tool for protesters and activists. The accumulation of too much suffering, injustice, poverty, and lack of freedom in many countries within the MENA region, I mean by that the Middle East and North Africa, led to people's revolt. In fact, the 21st century has witnessed the most unpredictable revolutions that started from an Arab country, Tunisia. The revolution in there was followed by a revolution in Egypt and a few others in Arab countries, but my focus will be on Tunisia and Egypt. Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who served as the president for Tunisia from 1987 to 2011, meticulously projected an image of Tunisia as a democratic country to the rest of the world. His regime, which was a sort of facade democracy, appeared robust and functional, at least until the uprising against his authoritarian rule came from within the country. On a historic day during a mass protest, the resounding words cry of dégage, French term meaning get out, reverberated through the streets. The people's unwavering determination to end up the grip of dictatorship ultimately forced Ben Ali and his regime to crumble, prompting him to flee the country on January the 14th, 2011. This momentous event marked a significant turning point in the history of Tunisia, setting in motion a series of events that would later be seen as catalysts for the broader Arab Spring movement. Dictators such as Ben Ali in Tunisia and Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, however, were always showing that they were great supporters of an economic system which guaranteed openness on the global market, taking European countries as a model. That was a strategy to be backed up by the world's power. The role of the media in both countries was important as by traditional media such as official newspapers and TV channels. They used to use pompous words to clean the image of the ruling party, making sure that the system, which was based on the one-party system, autocracy, if not plutocracy, does not appear to the word as such. Hence, the creation of false opposing parties to the ruling government and the illusion that a strong welfare state is put at the service of people were the most important arguments put forward to help these dictators remain in power. The reality as lived by the people in those countries was a totally different story, characterized by total absence of freedom. Any attempt to criticize the government was faced by violence and persecution. The ex-president of Tunisia, for example, created a strong police corps that harassed the population and frightened them. That has explained people's silence for years, the frustration of the people and the growing despair that permeated those societies started to take shape through different acts of despair, like self-immolation. But despite the fact that those acts were recurring in the whole region, free media that could have covered major events in the country were rather meant to protect dictators. What made the difference, though, was the internet. Despite its intensive control, the growing number of people using social networks, such as Facebook and Twitter, as well as getting more used to technological tools, grew faster than the ability of these governments to control them. The spark of the revolution was ignited by the mediatization of a particular event, which is the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi. On the 17th of December 2010, this Tunisian young street fruit vendor was slapped by a policewoman when he expressed his anger after the confiscation of his wares in Sidi Bouzid, a town in the center of Tunisia. The feeling of compassion was spread out in social networks, and thousands of people started to share on Facebook the video of Bouazizi burning himself and later watching his pictures in the hospital, the use of mobile phones to take picture videos and then publish them on Facebook or YouTube became widespread, and some videos went viral. And here I join what Andres has just said about journalism being kind of democratized, and that everyone can become a journalist in a way. So during the 14th of January 2011, people went out to disseminate the information through reporting the violence in recording videos. At the same time, the official TV channel diffused a video of the president visiting Bouzizi in the hospital. For the first time, the youth felt concerned by Bouzizi's condition, whom they perfuse as Hograd, a word used in Tunisian dialect, which literally means humiliation and indifference. The president sat in care for a person who self-immolated himself because of injustice did not seem to gain any credibility among the population. Many other reasons were no less important than humiliation, such as poverty and corruption, and contributed to worsening the situation. From that time on, the longing of the people for change and reforms were pushed to extremes that there were no turning back, not even through the multiple attempts of the president to show his will to do social reforms. Harsh confrontations took place with the police in different areas of the country, and while Tunisian three main demands were the right to have a job, liberty, and national dignity, the road to achieve that seemed to be a hard undertaking. Zuhair Yahyaoui was the first Tunisian blogger, cyber dissident, and human rights activist, known for his work in promoting freedom of expression and challenging censorship in Tunisia. He was the founder of the Tunisian website Tunisian, which he used as a platform to share critical and satirical content about the Tunisian government and to advocate for human rights. Yahyaoui faced harassment, arrest, and legal troubles due to his online activism. He was subjected to government censorship and repression. In 2004, he was arrested and imprisoned, which had a significant impact on his health. During his imprisonment, he executed 3 hunger strikes, which helped to draw the attention of the international community. Some human rights activist groups, like Reporters Without Borders, helped to draw attention to his case. After his release, he was still weakened by the hunger strikes and the torture he underwent. He passed away on the 13th of March 2005, and his death was seen as a symbol of the challenge faced by those who sought to challenge censorship and advocate for freedom of expression in Tunisia. Yahyaoui's activism and his use of the internet to express dissent made him a prominent figure in the lead-up to the Tunisian Revolution of 2010-2011. He used his platforms to criticize the government of President Zine Abdine Ben Ali, and his work contributed to the rising tide of discontent and protests in Tunisia. Indeed, a new wave of cyber activists and bloggers contributed to make people believe that the idea of change was still possible. The great number of people using internet and having access to Facebook and Twitter were influenced by the constant calls for freedom. In January the 3rd, 2011, there were massive cyber attacks on government websites in Tunisia. Many bloggers became known for the public despite their exile thanks to internet and more particularly the social network Facebook. The Tunisian blogger Sami Ben Gharbiya posted many blogs and articles against the President Ben Ali from Netherlands, the country where he was exiled. Many other bloggers were also accused to receive trainings in other countries, such as the USA. That was the case for the Tunisian female blogger Lilia Ben Hinni, who always refused to admit that, affirming that the revolution only came from within and mainly from people's frustration and suffering that lasts for many decades. The idea of revolution became more urgent among youngsters in this system known to be a gerontocratic one, a system that is based on the rule of all people and only and where young people are totally put aside and subject to unemployment and lack of opportunities. The ability of young people to get jobs was the most serious problem that made young people react against so much injustice, mainly by using technology. Dictators sought to control the internet, for example, to deny public access to information, Young people in Tunisia showed to be faster than those who used to control the web. As a consequence, the flame of the revolution was intense because it was led by the youth who were efficient in using social networks. What some people called Ben Ali's facade democracy was soon unveiled by his opponents. Among the most known were journalists who fought for freedom of speech and human rights, such as Siham bin Sidrin and Naziha Jiba. Both founded the online journal Kalima in 2000. In 2001, they also founded the Observatory for the Freedom of Press, Edition and Creation, l'Observatoire de la Liberté de la Presse, de l'édition de la création, OLPEC, a group that promoted freedom of the press and which was banned in Tunisia. These two journalists underwent as many injustices from the regime of Ben Ali. Ben Sidrin, for example, was subject to many restrictions and policy control. The confiscation of her passport lasted from 1994 until 2000. And in June 2001, she was arrested at the airport in Tunis, Carthage, after a television interview during which Ben Sidrin talked about the absence of rights in Tunisia. She also denounced abuses of the systematic use of torture. She complained about judicial corruption, and she was released a month later thanks to a national and international support. The same mistreatment was also directed to Naziha Jiba. She was indeed subject to government harassment and oppression. Jiba received a series of threats. Obscene fabricated photographs of her husband circulated. In 2008, vandals hacked into the Kalima webpage. Jiba accused the government of being responsible for vandalism and was summoned to court. To these political activists, the struggle should continue for fear the positive outcome of the revolution may concern the freedom of speech is lost because of the existence of an important percentage of people within the Arab world who showed their allegiance to authoritarian regimes. First, they claimed that democracy was not substantial to them. Secondly, they expressed their spoken fear of chaos. Egypt, known for much poverty as well, corruption and injustice, followed the Tunisian lead, and millions of Egyptians gathered in the Liberation Square, Maidan Tahrir in Cairo, starting from January 25th, 2011, in an attempt to topple the Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak. The case of Egypt was not better than that of Tunisia as far as the deterioration of the Egyptian people was concerned. Egypt became a republic in 18th of June 1953. The succession of presidents was first seen as a good sign for democracy before the assassination of the third president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, in October 18, 1981, and the advent of Hosni Mubarak to power. This latter remained almost 30 years as president of Egypt from 14th of October 1981 to the 18th of February 2011, and was thinking to transfer the presidency to his son Gamal. Though many of his supporters described Egypt during Mubarak's terms as a democracy, the opposition rather denounced an authoritarian regime. Those who opposed Mubarak also opposed his party, the National Democratic Party, NDP, because they viewed it as undemocratic. Opponents of the ruling party claimed that its leaders were asserting the possibility for electoral competition, while many parties such as the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafist Party Anwar were long banned from participating in electoral campaigns in Egypt. The threat that Egyptians would have a hereditary regime with Mubarak's willingness to grant presidency to his son became imminent in recent years, leading to further mobilization. In Egypt, many people reacted to the threat the political situation presented. The intention of Mubarak to keep power to himself and his sons triggered strong reactions through a movement to get rid of the one-party system. This movement was known as Kifaya, or Enough, the moniker of the Egyptian movement for change. demonstrations on Egypt intensified by the end of the year 2010 and reached its peak within the beginning of the new year 2011. Egyptians expressed their will to follow the path of the Tunisian people, which was able to overthrow Ben Ali. Hosni Mubarak was no longer as strong as before, and with the continuation of and intensification of the protests, he resigned on February the 11th, 2011. This unprecedented outcome would not be possible without the work of people such as Mohammed Adel wa Al-Ghanim, who were famous bloggers and activists in Egypt. Mohammed Adel was the founder of the April 6th Youth Movement, which is an Egyptian activist group that played a significant role in the lead up to the 2011 Egyptian revolution. The movement takes its name from a labor strike, which was one of the early sparks for political activism in Egypt. This movement initially focused on labor and workers' rights, but later broadened its scope to include political activism and advocating for democratic and political reforms. The group used social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter, to mobilize and organize protests and acts of civil disobedience against the government of President Hosni Mubarak. The movement gained prominence for its role in the organization of January 25th protests that eventually led to the ousting of President Mubarak. It was one of the key youth-driven movements behind the Egyptian revolution. Wa Al-Ghanim was an IT engineer and then Google's marketing director for the Middle East. He was mostly known for the creation of a Facebook page called We Are All Khaled Said, in memory of a young man who was brutally beaten by the police. The page became a focal point for organizing protests and sharing information about police brutality and government corruption. Ali Abdel Fattah is another Egyptian political activist, blogger, and software developer. He's known for his involvement in various political and human rights movements in Egypt. He played a prominent role during the 2011 Egyptian revolution, which led to the ousting of President Mubarak. He has been a vocal critic of the Egyptian government and has used social media and online platforms to advocate for political and civil rights. His activism has often focused on issues related to freedom of expression, political reform, and human rights in Egypt. Ahmed Douma is an Egyptian political activist and blogger as well. And he was one of the prominent figures in the We Are All Khaled Said movement. These young politicized leaders were said to receive trainings in centers which were specialized in nonviolent actions and strategies such as a famous one in Serbia, which was created in 1998 by Srđan Popović, a Serbian political activist who galvanized the population against the regime of Slobodan Milosevic. Popović was also the co-founder of the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, CANVAS, a non-governmental organization that specializes in the promotion of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience as a means of achieving social and political change. Popović gained international recognition for his role in the Otpor movement, which was a student-resistant movement in Serbia that played a significant role in the overthrow of Serbian President Milosevic in 2000. Otpor used creative and nonviolent tactics, including street protests and the use of symbols and slogans to mobilize public sentiment against the Milosevic regime. The movement's success in helping to bring about democratic change in Serbia has made Popovic a prominent figure in the field of nonviolent resistance and civil activism. After the success of the Otpor and the democratic transition in Serbia, Popovic and other activists worked with activists and civil society organizations around the world to promote nonviolent methods for achieving political and social change. They provided training and assistance to various movements seeking to challenge authoritarian regimes and promote democracy. And that's why a lot of these Arab activists were said to receive some of these trainings. Overall, the Arab Spring demonstrated the transformative power of the internet and social media in mobilizing and connecting people in the pursuit of political change, particularly in regions where traditional media were tightly controlled by the government. It also highlighted the complex and sometimes unpredictable outcomes that such movements can have. In Tunisia, despite the setbacks it has faced in its democratic transition since the constitutional coup on July 25th, 2029, and the closure of parliament, freedom of expression and social media continues to maintain a high level of the freedom it gained after the revolution. However, these gains are under threat from the ground power of the authorities, which one of the most significant threats being Decree 54, which levies penalties on social media, posts that criticize the government under the guise of protecting public security. In addition, the overall political climate in heading towards autocracy, as the president has amassed, well, the president, Kais Saied, has amassed significant powers in the new constitution of 2022. After suspending the 2014 constitution that was one of the outcomes of the revolution. Furthermore, the pronounced encroachment of the executive power and the judiciary has put the freedoms at greater risk, leading to renewed conflicts between bloggers, lawyers, and civil society activists who are striving to safeguard the revolution's achievements, particularly the freedom of expression against governmental pressures. Initially in Egypt, there was a sense of hope and optimism that the revolution would lead to greater freedom of expression and democracy, and a surge in freedom of expression on social media. People felt emboldened to share their opinions, organize protests, and discuss political matters openly. Social media platforms played a crucial role in organizing protests and political activism. Activists and opposition groups used platforms like Facebook and Twitter to mobilize and share information about events on the ground. And those social media allowed for the rapid dissemination of information, enabling Egyptians to stay informed about political developments, human rights abuses, and other critical issues. Even on traditional media such as television, new programs were presented by people who first became famous in social media and who were far from being journalists or TV presenters. Among the most viewed programs in the post-revolutionary period, a program presented by Youssef Hussein, who is an Egyptian comedian, YouTube content maker, and a political satirist. He first became famous after presenting the Joe Tube program on YouTube, and later the Joe Show program on Al Arabi TV network. During the presidency of Mohamed Morsi, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood Party, from 2012 to 2013, Hussein presented his program from his country, Egypt, but after Morsi was deposed in a coup, he left Egypt due to the new restrictions imposed by Morsi's successor, Abdel Fattah Sisi. Bassem Youssef worked as a heart surgeon in Egypt before transitioning into a career in comedy and television. He's an Egyptian comedian, writer, and gained international recognition for his show El Barnamij, the program. It is translated into the program. El Barnamij is a Arabic term, which was often referred to as the Daily Show of Egypt. البرنامج aired from 2011 to 2014 and was highly popular in Egypt and across the Arab world. The show used humor and satire to provide a critical perspective on current events, politics, and social issues in Egypt and the region. Bassem Youssef was often unapologetic in his critique of the government, official policies, and media outlets. His satirical approach and sharp wit made him a controversial figure in Egyptian politics, and he faced legal challenges and threats as a result of his content, leading him to leave Egypt as well. Therefore, the situation has evolved, and today the Egyptian government under President Abdel Fattah Sisi has cracked down on dissent, both online and offline. Social media platforms have been used to identify and target activists and critics of the regime. Besides, the government has increased censorship and surveillance of social media platforms, websites, websites and content critical of the government are often blocked, and security agencies monitor online activities. Activists and individuals critical of the government have faced arrest, detention, and prosecutions for their online activities. The government has used anti-terrorism laws and other legal mechanisms to silence dissent. Fearing repercussions, many individuals have resorted to self-censorship on social media, refraining from discussing sensitive political issues or criticizing the government. The government has gained greater control over traditional media outlets, which has limited the diversity of voices in the media landscape. This makes social media even more crucial for alternative viewpoints. Political activists and software developers have faced also multiple arrests and imprisonments in Egypt, such as Ala Abdel Fattah. He was initially arrested in 2014 for allegedly organizing a political protest without proper authorization. After serving time in prison, he was released but remained on parole for 5 years, which required him to spend 20 hours daily at a police station. In 2019, during the Egyptian protests, he was arrested again by the National Security Agency, and specific charges were not disclosed at the time. He was later convicted of spreading fake news and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In April 2022, he began a hunger strike as a form of protest. Juma also has been an outspoken critic of the Egyptian government, and he actually faced arrests and legal challenges due to his opposition to the government. After the revolution, the April 6th youth movement also faced challenges and divisions. As the political landscape in Egypt became increasingly complex, the movement has gone through various phases, with some members continuing their activism, while others faced legal challenges and restrictions from the government. Today, human rights organizations call for the immediate release of the former spokesman of the April 6th youth movement. Also, Mohammed Adel was condemned, and after he already spent 5 years in pre-trial detention in a case stemming solely from his peaceful exercise of freedom of expression, and accusing him of spreading false news on social media. The undersigned organizations assert that this verdict demonstrates that the Egyptian authorities, including the judiciary, are targeting political activists with bogus charges and subjecting them to unfair trials as a punishment for their peaceful activities, despite presidential initiatives and government statements, attempting to imply an improvement in the human rights situation in Egypt. The organizations call for the immediate release of Mohammed Adel and other prisoners of conscience in Egypt. In summary, where revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt initially led to increased freedom of expression on social media, the subsequent government's actions have resulted in a significant crackdown on dissent and the restrictions of online freedoms. This complex situation demonstrates that evolving dynamics of freedom of expression in the digital age, where governments in the Arab countries can both harness the power of social media for their own purposes and use it as a means of control. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Manuel, for the interesting presentation. I think we will have questions for you. Who wants to start?
Sorry, can I put kind of video of some of the photos that were gathered in a book entitled Irada, while actually maybe answering the questions?
Yes, of course, it's a possibility. Yes, you may, of course.
Thank you.
So I just can see that there are some questions. Yeah, Andre.
I raised my hand, but I think you do not see it.
Yeah, exactly. Two people have rose. Yeah, Andre and Erin. Andre first.
Okay, thank you. Manal, thank you very much. Very interesting and very sobering, actually. It's scary how the government can restrict the online environment, even in this day and age with VPNs and things. I'm interested in the face of all these restrictions. Has it led to a much less robust public sphere environment online in Tunisia and Egypt, or are people still participating? Perhaps, you know, exiles, people who are living abroad. Is there still some, you know, interesting and valuable and valid deliberations and things happening on social media in these countries, or not at all? Are the restrictions just so strict that it's impossible to do anything?
Well, there is still, thank you for this question, Andre. There is still a lot of good contribution, especially from the people who actually not live in Egypt, as it is really considered today to be a dictatorship under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And so, for example, Yusuf Hussein, who presents Joe Show, is still watched all over the Arab world, but Hussein does not live anymore in Egypt. So he's presented from London, for example. So those people actually still have a say, and their word is pretty much respected. But restrictions within Egypt, for example, are very obvious, and so that really limits the people who live inside the country. Bassem Youssef also left the country, and he lives in the US. That's why he still contributes to political activism from the outside, though. Well, in Tunisia also, there are a lot of restrictions today, and there are a lot of political activists who were imprisoned recently, and they started strike hangers because of Qais Said's new restrictions as well. So despite the fact that there is still contribution, but there is this fear that is installed again because of the risk of being imprisoned or harassed by the governments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Irene, you have a question?
I do, if Manel is finished responding.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much for this talk. I'm just endlessly fascinated by different uses for these network technologies, especially when we to see how it's being used for political organization and activism. It says my internet connection is unstable, so I hope this is clear. I was wondering if you came across or have read into your data a little bit about, or if there were at all, any creative tactics that were used by these individuals to mitigate online risk or to circumvent censorship, rather than simply just deactivating their accounts or making them private or stopping, ceasing with their discourse altogether. Did that come up at all, or was that anything you observed?
Well, thank you, Erin, for this question. Actually, most of those youth activists are IT engineers. Most of the time, this is what I actually noticed, and they are so much. They are very much able to even attack Tunisian governmental websites, and this is what Zuhair Yahawi did in 2004, 2005. He was the first cyber dissident who was actually tortured by Zine Abidine Ben Ali's regime. He even though he used to use a pseudonym to kind of cover his actions, yet there was such a strong control on the internet that they were still able to prosecute him and find about his doings, and so I think that any countering of the policies of or the strategies that these young users of technology used were in a way faced failure. I was also going to speak about a strategy, for example, that they used, which is, as I mentioned in my presentation, the pertinent slogans or words that actually were very pertinent and kind of were able to mobilize people, such as words, simple words, for example, get out, irhal, dégage in French, were enough to mobilize people. The word kifaya in Egypt, which translates into enough, was also very much telling to people to end up the oppression they suffered from for decades. So these kind of easy and simple but very useful and efficient tools were enough to kind of trigger and incite people to go to the streets, and they were really they felt concerned about what was going on after so much forced indifference as to politics in their respective countries.
Okay,
I hope I answered your question, Erin. Thank you very much for
Manel.
asking. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will have a short break, and we will probably be back in 6 or 7 minutes. And we will welcome Johannes Angemüller. Thank you very much, Manel.
Thank you.
So I'm very glad to welcome Johannes Angemüller, He is a professor of discourse, languages, and applied linguistics at Open University in the United Kingdom. He is a member of the Center for Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick, and is also a member of the Centre d'études des mouvements sociaux at École des études en sciences sociales. His main fields of research are discourse analysis, linguistics, pragmatics, sociology of higher education, political communication, mass media culture, and methods and theories in social research. He is the founding president of DiscourseNet, an interdisciplinary and international network of discourse researchers. He has published 8 books, 18 edited books, more than 30 journal articles, and more than 60 articles and edited volumes. He's very active in editing articles. For instance, he is a member of the board of several international journals. His research today will focus on the challenges of studying social media as a regime of visibility. His speech today is entitled Social Media as a Regime of Discursive Invisibility. We're listening to you, Johannes.
Yeah, thanks, Grégoire. Very nice to be here and to share some thoughts about the challenges of social media for discourse studies. I want to start with some ideas on how discourse and the public sphere has been conceptualized traditionally in various disciplines. And I guess the most important and well-known approach is from Habermas, the idea of the public sphere, which is a space of encounters, of exchanges between society and the state. And here the idea is that in a way the public sphere is the space where public opinion is constructed, which allows people to translate different interests and values into the democratic process. Now, Habermas was published his study of the structural changes of the public sphere in 1962. That's a long time ago. And if we have a look at some other approaches, we see some evolution in the 1970s, late 1970s, with the advent of early German critical discourse studies. Jäger, probably you don't know these references. Here, the idea is a more kind of process-oriented view of discourse, centered on the interdiscourse. The interdiscourse is the space where all kind of citizens come together for meaning making, and it's also the space where special discourses kind of intersect, like science or professional discourses, whatever. And here in this graphic on the right, you see a process view of that idea of an interdiscourse as the general space in which different special discourses are embedded, and we see different strands and strings of discourse which are intertwined, and all that is moving in time from past to the present to the future. So still, I mean, we have the idea that discourse is very much centered in a general discursive space where everybody comes together. This is an idea which is very prevalent for all kinds of discourse approaches. I mean, I won't go into the French School of Discourse Analysis, where, of course, the public sphere as a kind of idea, as a regulatory ideal, is quite important in something like Pécheux, and to some degree also in Foucault. And this is something which we can also find in the discourse, critical discourse approaches, like the discourse historical approach by Ruud Wodak, where the idea is that we can map a certain discursive area. And here, for example, we see the idea that there's certain topics which we can identify through discursive research, and thus exhaustively represent the discursive area. Of course, this is something which is deeply ingrained in the discourse analytical practices, and especially, of course, in corpus linguistics and lexicometry. In many studies up to today, the idea is that we can collect corpora in a way so as to represent the overall discursive space. It might be a subspace of the overall public sphere, but the idea is that we can represent that discursive space. Now, that idea is coming under attack, and this is something that has a lot to do with the advent of digital media. And I want to point out the different types of discourses that we're talking about that have led to the crisis of the traditional public sphere. The traditional idea of a public sphere with a public opinion that is constructed in public media is something that is very much tied to newspaper discourse, so-called legacy media, where we have a certain format. Journalists as professional gatekeepers, they fill certain sections in the newspaper which need to be filled every day or every week. So we have a quite stable idea of the different areas that need to be covered by journalists. And also, since these are always broad churches, professional gatekeepers need to make sure there's a balance and a representation of different ideological strands. Of course, newspapers have certain ideological tendencies, and people know about whether it's more like left or right-wing leaning. But the idea of a newspaper is to represent the overall space through that specific media format, which is stable and has regular headings. And so here we see the construction, the ideological construction of the idea of a public opinion. Professional gatekeepers, they're led to represent in a way the center ground from the different ideological positions, of course, but they're drawn together in something like a center area where people can meet, and this is where the ideology of public opinion is very much anchored. So in a nutshell, the idea of public opinion, of a public sphere, is very much tied to the institutional structure, the technological format of newspaper, and that's of course something that is something of a past today. With a turn to digitally mediated discourses, we no longer have that kind of pulling together of different opinions in one overall newspaper space. We have controversies that take place. They always recruit their followers. These are very dynamic communities depending on the specific controversies. And they're often led by self-made influencers who are very much incentivized to make noise. This is, of course, a career that has also been interesting for many journalists. And we see that these new incentive structures that have opened up with a click media has led some journalists to become populist spokespersons and kind of follow a new kind of ideological agenda. These controversies are often created in ideological bubbles, which has led to polarization and in many cases to extremism. And of course, we're not talking about an equal space. We're talking about highly unequal subject positions with very unequal visibility of these different actors. A few influencers having a lot of attention, a lot of followership, and the many clicks from the passive followers point to large masses that construct and construe these very visible subject positions without really having a say themselves. So what we see here in this new space of digitally mediated discourse is a crisis of representation. If we had in the classical legacy media discourse the idea of newspapers representing public opinion in a way between various ideological positions, here we have the idea that public discourse is dominated by few representatives of controversies that are very dynamic, with always shifting communities. And the problem, of course, these influencers or internet brokers, they don't really represent any kind of value groups in society. They represent the most clicks, and these clicks come, of course, from all kinds of different ideological backgrounds. And once these very dominant social media brokers have occupied a position of visibility, it is very difficult not to see and recognize their ideological agenda. So in a way, I mean, Trump, of course, is a product of all of us talking about him and following him in our Twitter account, and his followers are by no means all Trump fans. I mean, most people talking about Trump are not fans of him at all. But since he's occupying such a very central position, he's able to impose his ideological agenda. And so we see here a kind of very important democratic problem of representation, which needs to be solved in digital discourse. Now, the problem in discourse studies is with these classical models of the discursive space as an overall space of encounters of different ideological positions. This is something that we need to rethink. And the problem is, how can we study? And what I would like to do in the remainder of my contribution here is to propose a model or new model that allows us to study digitally mediated discourse. And which is a model which is much more decentered, which doesn't think that there's an overall space with defined positions, but it's very much centered on controversies. Let me just see, and I will start from an example just to give you some kind of empirical reference very quickly. The controversy around hydroxychloroquine, which was sold as a possible remedy for coronavirus at the beginning of the pandemic by some doctors, like Didier Raoult, and I'm sure the French people here, they still remember him. And he cited studies from China about the possibility to use this widely used drug in order to reduce the deaths of coronavirus. And once Raoult published his first paper in March 2020, Donald Trump immediately took it up on his Twitter account, and he was lauding the study and raised the promise of treating coronavirus with hydroxychloroquine. This was also then taken up by many other actors, including Bolsonaro, and it all created a kind of fuzz in the populist circles as a possibility in order to overcome the pandemic without major restrictions. And so it was really a science discourse entering political discourses and getting intertwined with these dynamics of positioning, of struggles over domination in the public sphere, very much about antagonisms between different political camps, identities, and all that. And yeah, so how can we reconceptualize then the idea of the discursive space? I mean, with that example in the background, and I mean, of course, we can give many other examples and perhaps see other ways of representing the discursive space. But I think what we see here is it's a quite sudden emergence of a topic of great controversy. Of course, the intervention of Trump was hugely problematic for many people, which helped him to become so important in this debate. And in a way, visibility was really very much at the center here, and Trump is a visibility creating machine through controversies that are started in order to mobilize all kinds of people, and especially many people who reject him. And so more generally, we can say that discourse is a space where we see these different controversies popping up, and this is very dynamic. And these controversies mobilize different communities. So it's not one kind of citizenship that is behind that, but every time these questions mobilize different people, and there are different dynamics, sometimes quite surprising and new. So these controversies lead to new discursive hierarchies. Trump, of course, has been able to occupy the space of controversies for such a long time that it's not possible to ignore the visibility from the different controversies. But in many cases, controversies are specific, so they lead to specific hierarchies around specific topics, and only rarely, such as in the case of Trump, can visibility from different controversies be used for new controversies. So these controversies are in a way dynamics mobilizing more or less quickly large communities, large communities. And in these controversies, there will be some subjects bubbling up, some people, actors who get some visibility, and normally within a short period of time, depending on how many people are involved and how hot the debate is, very few people will represent the debate, which is, of course, which has happened in hydroxychloroquine. We see some subjects with a great deal of visibility. Trump, of course, in the US and worldwide. Raoult, very important in the French-speaking discourse. He was never really picked up very much in the American discourse, even though he gave some interviews on public TV in the US. But the debate was very quickly hijacked by Trump and others in the UK, because, of course, language is a very important barrier in the translation of these controversies. And what we can see here is a link of different controversies between the Chinese scientific debate and the various languages, Bolsonaro and Portuguese, with a different kind of political background, but all linked in a way together in this very dynamic, fast-shifting environment of a decentered discursive space with many controversies which can feed each other. And so what happens in these debates is a great deal of hierarchy between subject positions that can gain a lot of visibility. And thanks to social media, we can objectify the hierarchies very easily nowadays. These are some numbers from American politicians with their visibility on Twitter. I think this is 2016. I'm not quite sure, so it's old data, and you can already see that Trump, by far and large, he dominated the American political scene in terms of Twitter visibility. And this is, of course, something that many traditional actors were very much caught by surprise in the electoral campaign between Trump and Hillary Clinton. Clinton, of course, had nothing like that to counter Trump. And we see that there's a certain type of discourse which is represented by Donald Trump and AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, which is very successful on social media. And this is, of course, a much more antagonistic discourse. It's not committed to the idea of public opinion, of a kind of center ground. It is very much about emotions and kind of lots of controversies with new people kind of entering the debate. And so classical, more institutional types of politicians, up to Barack Obama, who did have a successful internet campaign, but a long time ago, they don't really have any chance against the controversy machines that we see here at the top. So, of course, these are not just dynamic hierarchies. To some degree, these hierarchies, they mobilize existing institutional structures, like between different media enterprises. Here, what you can see is the presence of media outlets in the world in Twitter, the 500 most present ones. So you see that if you have a look at visibility from an institutional media point of view, there's just a very few outlets that really make a difference worldwide. And this, of course, is something that also depends a lot on non-discursive resources, I mean, visibility is something that is constructed, emerges in these spontaneous dynamics of controversies to some degree, but not in a kind of empty space. There's lots of political, economic interests that need to be accounted for, which explain, for example, why Fox News has become so important. You may be aware of the role of Robert Murdoch, and the same can be said about any of these actors. So these actors, of course, mobilize all kinds of non-discursive resources, which create constellations in which some actors can become hyper visible as subjects. Now, it's not only about these spontaneous emergences of visibility of actors, but visibility is, of course, very much tied to institutional games. And we can think of elections, for example, where the most visible subjects are rewarded institutionally and recognized institutionally as representatives of certain communities. And this is, of course, a very democratic process in the political arena. It's also a process that we can see in many other arenas, like in the science arena. In our field, of course, in discourse analysis or in any kind of social sciences, we can see exactly the same dynamics. Well, not exactly the same dynamics, but we see a great deal of concentration of visibility in very few figures that feed certain controversies among academics. And then, I mean, some people get a lot of get a lot of reputation as academics, and sometimes this can be translated into coveted positions in academic institutions. So these controversies can have some very concrete institutional, political, economic effects. Some scientists become very well paid. Others they work without being paid or even recognized as publishing. Similarly, in social media discourse in the political arena, there's of course a few elite actors or some actors who become elite through these dynamics. They enter institutions, they can translate their discursive visibility into institutional, economic, political power, and the other way around. I mean, their power also needs to be translated into discursive visibility. And others, the grassroots people in whatever kind of organizations, they do a lot of work without ever being recognized in such ways. So we see this kind of cooperation between the free market of discursive visibility, where a few actors concentrate, monopolize the attention of these huge debates, and you have the institutional area where resources, economic resources in terms of positions, institutional positions, are allocated to various people, which follow certain organizational rules. It works very differently, and in these discourses, these two areas are kind of interconnected. I am trying to come to an end. Where are we with the time? I don't see the clock, Grégoire.
Well, you have 7, 8 minutes to finish your presentation.
Thank you. What I would suggest in order to work on discourse, I mean, if the traditional way in a way was to represent the discursive space with its various actors, ideologies, positions, topics, I think in the decentered space of digital immediate discourse, this is no longer really possible. And we need to think about new ways to do discourse analysis. And one thing I would suggest, and I'm sure there are others, is to start with the subjects. Subjectivity is the major problem, the major stake in these discourses. I mean, in any discourse, of course, we enter discourse in order to become visible, to make a difference as subjects. And this is something that is an effect of all kinds of discursive practices. The subjects are not equal by nature from a discursive point of view. They become subjects by entering discourse, by using language, by participating in social games. And the question here is how the linguistic and the social practices are interconnected. Because of course, language is very much about giving visibility to subjects, to speakers. We produce speech acts in order to show ourselves. I mean, we say certain things, but at the same time, we construct our own subject position. And this is something that can be, I mean, that has been analyzed by speech act theorists, pragmaticians for a very long time. It's of course very central to all kinds of discourse approaches where the idea is that subjectivity is the central question. I mean, from Pecheux to Foucault and many others. And here, I mean, we can apply things like enunciation theory, la linguistique de l'énonciation, in order to think about the different speaking positions, the voices, the perspectives, the points of view that are activated whenever we use utterances, les énoncés du discours, in order to give visibility to the various speakers that are flagged up in discourse. And this is a process that is very fundamental to any kind of language-based discourse. We use utterances in order to make visible our own positions and the positions of others, the locutor and the allocutor. And some of these positions that are flagged up in discourse are anonymous, and they're too obvious in order to be named. But in many cases, of course, the major positions in discourse are named, and you see that in texts, you see all kinds of references to people with certain names in the social world. Like, of course, Trump in the Twitter post he posted, I mean, you see the name of Trump in the Twitter post. You see the reference to the study. The study will refer to Tuaold. And so people who understand the octoriality of these discourses, they understand very well where these discourses come from. And this is very fundamental to any discourse and the way we interpret them. Now, what many linguists do is they're very happy to analyze texts and utterances and the complex ways they refer to subjectivity and enact subjectivity. We can see the different polyphonic layers that are mobilized here. And but I think if we really want to account for discourse as an object of the social world, we need to be aware that, of course, any linguistically constructed subject is something that also plays a role and is made relevant in social games. And we need to kind of understand how linguistically enacted and constructed subject positions make a difference among actors of social arenas or in the social space. And of course, if you act in the political institutional arena, you need many people using utterances and texts in order to make you visible. I mean, you campaign for yourself in the same way that academics, they need to create a name in order to make a difference. This is very important. But the difference is not just a property of the texts. It is very much a property of the large communities that are mobilized in that arena. And so we need to think about the actors that can use these subject positions in order to make a difference in social games of positioning between actors, like, for example, in parties. Social media visibility is very important, of course, in order to win a primary and then national elections. And this is something that is inscribed in a larger social space, which is, of course, to some degree constructed by these actors, but to some degrees these are structures which also shape what actors can do. So these social subject positions are inscribed in hegemonic formations. Of course, they mobilize existing party political divisions They work with existing spaces of political groups and movements. We've seen some great deal of dynamics in France, for example, the splitting of the traditional center right into a extremist right wing, a populist left wing, and some sort of liberal leaning centrist ground, if you want to call it like that. And this is, of course, something that can be observed in many countries. So with the advent of social media, of course, the traditional organization between two, let's say, respectable parties that represent a large spectrum from centrist towards more kind of radical strands of left and right. These kind of broad churches parties have been exploded in a way, and we see a more kind of antagonistic type of discourse in these areas. So political actors that become visible in this arena, they need to work with these dynamics, and they do. And of course, this is also embedded in a larger socioeconomic space, where these subject positions that are constructed and also offered as political solutions to the electorate, they also resonate with larger socioeconomic divisions, educational divisions, geographical divisions, for example, between large cosmopolitan cities and the more rural areas. This is, of course, something that resonates a lot with all kinds of existing non-discursive divisions. And we need to understand how subjectivity as a kind of discursive, very visible phenomenon is constructed in these larger social spaces. I want now to come to the end of my presentation by just summarizing a few things. I mean, my approach is very much, let's follow these subjects in a decentered controversy, which means we need to understand the practices, the processes that are involved that allow people to enter controversies and occupy a certain subject position by becoming visible as recognized members of a community. This is something that always needs to be done from scratch. We don't have a natural corpus, for example, we can rely on. We need to understand how controversy mobilizes different people and leads to the production of certain texts and posts and whatever kind of contributions. This is a very kind of dynamic process. In a way, every time a controversy takes place, a new corpus is constructed, and not by us. It's the practice of those who participate in these controversies to understand the relevant texts and choose them in order to get an idea of the new social discursive space that is constructed every time such a controversy takes place. So, and just to wrap it up here, one way to deal with this new situation of an exploded public sphere is to focus on the subject positions that are constructed and understand how they draw on the various linguistic and social processes that are involved in the construction of subject positions, which of course is a very much process-oriented view on the public space. And it also takes seriously the discursive as well as the non-discursive resources that are mobilized whenever such subject positions bubble up. And this is not only about the most visible stars like Trump and those monopoly subjects, but it's also about the subjectivity of many others. I mean, why do people click the Twitter posts of these people? They also, of course, participate in these discourses and as more or less visible subjects. So it's something that we can study from all kinds of different angles. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your critical reactions.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for your brilliant presentation and the different theoretical approaches that you mentioned. We will have probably 6 or 7 minutes for questions. Erin. you have a question.
Yes, I don't want to monopolize all the questions either if other people have them. Thank you very much, Johannes, for this presentation and for really just gathering, I think, what is a lot of very helpful literature on digital discourse analysis for distilling that, because it can be a complex thing to distill sometimes. So thank you very much for that. I'm curious about where you see this going. Previously with Twitter being what it was, I feel like that is kind of the home for a lot of this political discourse that you were speaking of. And obviously now that Twitter has kind of taken on a new face, and there are sort of these new Twitter economies that contribute to these regimes of invisibility. It's added a new layer of complexity, to say the least, to this. So I'm curious what you think about the future construction of these spaces, specifically in regard to subjectivity, and if you see a new space coming out, or if you see that space being something that will be continually frequented by these actors and perhaps by smaller actors. Maybe you could share your thoughts on that.
This is a very good question. Thanks. I haven't really thought about the future coming from a kind of empirical social sciences background. And I mean, maybe I can express a hope. I guess people become aware of the dilemmas and the huge kind of democratic challenges of the way that digital media discourses have functioned in the way that they give visibility to very few people, which of course can be a big threat to all kinds of institutional, democratic, and civilized ways of interaction. And I guess there's a great need to regulate discourse in order to make sure that we can ensure a free kind of space where people who have different things to contribute can exchange over them. This is not possible with one Twitter account dominating all the others. And I think the big question we're having now is about how we can make sure that these unwanted effects are controlled. This is, I think, really very much about the way that that free speech is conceptualized in the US, which has a very culturally very specific idea of free speech as the possibility of anybody to say anything, irrespective of the real world monopolies that are created through these dynamics. And I think what we need to understand in order to deal with this problem is that the discursive arena should be seen like economic arenas in order to get beyond these problems. Even the most rabid neoliberal American, whatever kind of free market enthusiasts, they would nowadays, in most cases, I mean, well, not the most neoliberal ones, but most will totally accept the idea that cartels, monopolies are a problem in the economic world, and that we need regulations of markets in order to ensure that they're functioning well. We need to apply that idea to the discursive world, which I think many people are very hesitant to do in liberal countries like the US, because they have this very moral idea of discourse, and I think this is wrong. So we need to see the real world effects of digitally mediated discourse and how they lead to the incredible concentration of not only discursive resources like visibility, but also of non-discursive resources. And this means we need to see the arena of discourse as just another social arena, which needs to be institutionally regulated, where we need democratic decision making, and reflection on how healthy and civilized discourse can can take place. Whether this is going into that direction, I'm not entirely sure yet. I think what we are experiencing now with the advent of this new technology is a great deal of confusion, and many actors still need to grapple with the medium and learn how to do it. I mean, there's artificial intelligence now, which will make a huge difference, and I think it will swamp us with all kinds of fake news, and it will make the capacities of these very few actors increasingly even more important in order to control the public space, and so I think that will be the big kind of tension between, I mean, technologies that give discursive presence arms. I mean, these are really discursive arms of sometimes destruction to some actors. And on the other hand, there's a great deal of dynamics in terms of regulation. I mean, some parliaments have reacted very quickly. I mean, and this is real. I mean, we have GDPR, for example. I mean, this is a really kind of very important legislation, especially coming from the European Union. And I think that tension will go on. And the question is, who's faster? Are these new technology-driven actors able to destroy our public sphere, our democratic achievements, or can we regulate them before?
Thanks very much for that very, very full answer. I'll be thinking on that for a while.
Thank you very much, Joans. I'm afraid we won't have time for another question. And,
thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much once again, Joans. Now I'm welcoming Camilla Reisler-Cavalcanti. Last but not least, I'm very glad to welcome you, Camilla. You are a PhD candidate at the linguistics program of Universidade Federal do Espírito Santo, Brazil, under the supervision of Professor Fabio Malini. She holds a master's degree in linguistics from the same program. You are currently living in Stockholm, and Camilla focuses on multimodal critical discourse analysis combined with network analysis of interactions of social media platforms. She has been approaching the possibilities of unfolding the datasets collected on Greta Thunberg's engagement on social media to understand better the impact of social media on activism. She has written her paper with her supervisor, Fabio Malini, who is an associate professor at the Department of Social Communication at the Federal University of Espírito Santo, Brazil, where he coordinates the Laboratory for Research on Image and Cyberculture. He is a professor of the postgraduate program in linguistics, and he has a PhD in communication from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The presentation today is entitled Unveiling Greta Thunberg's Retweeting, the Power of the Discursive Strategy in Digital Environmental Advocacy. Oh, you have just changed your title, I'm sorry. So the role of retweeting in Greta Thunberg's climate advocacy. We're listening to you, Camilla.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone. And I must say that I'm a bit nervous after all these wonderful presentations. And about the title is we've been grappling with this title for a while now, as retweeting as reported speech, but I will talk about it further on. So how we started with this, the role of tweeting and retweeting, we delve into the world of social media and the role of climate activism. So specifically, we decided to explore the social actor's role. And I say social actor because I'm not talking about the girl Greta Thunberg specifically. I'm talking about the social actor on Twitter. And how she has harnessed the power of retweeting and tweeting to gain visibility and leverage, both online and on the streets. So we saw Twitter back then when we started this, as a potent tool for spreading awareness and fostering engagement and encouraging collective action in the fight against climate change. So this is, of course, now we see that it's a bit of a romantic view, because there's a whole question of visibility and access to internet and who gets to see these things. So in studying social media and networks, we must never forget that we are part of the network, and that also has an impact on how we collect and approach the data that, and also consequently the corpus that we select. Which means that we are not a separate part of the corpus. We're not zoomed out of the corpus, because once we retweet or once we interact on social media, we generate more interactions. So in that sense, all discourses are embodied to construct meaning. And we also have to think, as we heard before, that we have to take into consideration the dynamicity, I don't know if that's how you say it, of the platforms that are changing. We talk about Twitter, which is ex-Twitter, and that has impacted our corpus and how we approach the corpus as well. So that is, if some aspects might seem a coincidence sometimes in social media, what we observe and what lands on our corpus files is also a consequence of our own entanglements on social media. So for example, had I not lived here in Sweden in 2016, had I not had 2 daughters around Greta Thunberg's age, had I not been an English teacher for 25 years for teens, so I am always in contact with these people and listening to what they have to say, maybe Greta would have never landed on my feeds. I would never know about her. So I was curious about why my students in Brazil, and I was living in Brazil for the past 5 years again, did not know who Greta was, did not know what she was doing. I had not heard about climate change. So, and neither did my daughters. So I was very curious about that. And then there's another coincidence that my supervisor, Professor Malini, he was in England, and had he not taken his uncle to a touristy ride in Manchester, I think it was, he would not have ended up by mistake in a huge climate strike in 2019. And he said, "Oh, what's going on? I'm going to collect this data." So we both noticed that we were looking into what Van Dijk calls a macro movement, which he says that it's a scattered macro movement is a scattered minority, when scattered minorities become the majority under a discursive influence, mainly of one or a few social actors. And in our case, it's Greta Thunberg. So what sparked our interest is how the social actor started off. I can change my slide, why not? Yeah, okay. Started off here in 2018, and in 1 year, in 2019, went to here. So I'm just going back a bit. This is Greta Thunberg in 2018. She was alone. She skipped school on a Friday to start this strike for the climate. And also from a personal perspective, now being 1.5 years in Sweden again, she was also lucky that some journalist went by and took a picture of her and also made an article about her. Because here in Sweden, you have a free speech law. I would say that anyone can say anything on public space, as long as it doesn't, I would say, harm anyone. Now we have seen these Quran burnings, which are changing a little bit how the mentality of what free speech is and what does harm mean. But what I mean is that, like Greta, there are many others in public spaces saying many things, and many of them have become just part of the view. They are just there every day and nobody listens anymore. So we were wondering how she got to here. So this graph is from September 2019. And here she had already reached, after 1 year, a very prominent influencing position online and offline, in which her narration received a lot of credibility. And I would say, we would argue, a reputation at par with legacy media, almost like you said, mainstream media, and even started discrediting some mainstream media for what they were saying and institutions. So it became a war of narratives, and she was a central hub on climate activism. So I think we all here share similar views on how social actors online have impacted journalism and how we inform people, because we all know we can act as news channels, we are witnesses, we are reporters, we are correspondents, we are consumers, content producers, and it's all at once and at real time. So an important difference to take note is that our current market also sees children and the youth as very good customers for attention, for the attention economy. So the question of access and of attention is important, but what we will mention that she has become what Barabasi says is a crucial bridge or a central hub to a specific group, specifically in the North, in the global North, climate activism. And for this graph, when we started collecting, we started, of course, I was very active on Twitter and my professor as well. We saw which terms were being used. So we collected climate change, climate crisis, strike, and this is what we got. And so we get about 20 terms, and we started adding through time as we saw what was emerging in the interactions on Twitter. And very interestingly, these terms, they ended up also becoming hashtags, and which makes our data collection much easier. And then, then I'm going to skip this quote, but here I have something about Bakhtin. This was today on Twitter. This is what Greta does every Friday. She posts every Friday her school strike. But now I'm going to say how the study came about. So back in 2019, the initial research question was, how does the social actor Greta Thunberg represent the current climate activism via Twitter? In that sense, we wanted to know who and what actions are included and excluded, which people were mentioned, who was part of it. And the first thing that was very evident is that the word youth. So in that sense, youth also became a representation of climate activism for this group, a little bit excluding older people and other environmental activists, which was handled well by other groups being created, such as Mothers for Future, Fathers for Future. So this was handled very well by the groups participating. And also which discursive strategies are employed to combat climate change and to inform. And so the first challenge was deciding how to approach the corpora that emerges from this ever-changing configuration. And so the initial framework was this one. We thought about the representation of social actors and actors from Van Leuven, which includes basically gives us a toolbox to see who's included in the discursive sphere and who's excluded, and which actions are expected from climate activists, what words are they expected to say. Recontextualization from Wodak and Van Leuven, because it's a process of changing the meaning and significance as each time a new discourse is embedded in a new context. And this creates naturally a dialogic chain and uses the discourse of the other. And the macro movement, like I said, which is not one movement concentrated in one physical space. Now we have this macro movements of small minorities even participated in scattered online movements. Des représentations du discours autre from Haute Revue, where reported speech comes with heterogeneity, either overtly or camouflaged. And I like Cunha very much, where she says the resumption it's not even a reported speech, it's more a resumption where we take the discourse of the other and appropriate to make it our own. So the social practices online, they legitimize or delegitimize social actors. And we not only have to take into account the structure of the language, but how also multimodal discourses and affordances of the platform and how they are embedded into practices. And then we had, when analyzing this, we were all very happy, but then we had the pandemics and we sort of went a little desperate when this happened because nobody posted anything on anymore, and we didn't know if the social movements were ever going to go back to the streets. But then unfortunately, after the George Floyd incident, people were courageous enough to go back to the streets. And this is what we had in 2021, September, a month before the COP26. So this graph refers to September 2021, just before the COP, and we say it's a spark of outrage and hope, like Estelle says it. Each cluster here represents what we call perspectives, a discursive community maybe. And this unfolded for us various possibilities of approaching this corpus. Like we said, we still collected the terms, and we separated some of the perspectives, and I will show to you, and it comes for us as net perspectivism. And the characteristics of perspectives is that they are conceptual gathering forces based on affinity that creates the clusters, that when analyzed separately operate discourses, images, social bonds that attract or repel. And they show power relations that translate into dispute over hegemony of narrative of facts, ideas, and products, interests. And profiles are influential operators that neutralize, diffuse, overlap other perspectives. So I will give an example here from, if you look at the light blue, you see Greta Thunberg in the center. That's Greta Thunberg's perspective for this week only. And I have here, this is her most retweeted tweet of that week. That week she tweeted about 120 times. And here what she does, she gets an article from New York Times. This is where the reported speech comes in. She gets an article from the reported Times, gets one sentence from the article. The global average temperature will rise 2.7 degrees Celsius by centuries, and even if all the countries meet their promised emission cuts. And then she makes a comment on it. And she says, and we're of course far from reaching even these highly insufficient targets. How long will we let this madness go on? And here she's already saying who's we, in the sense she is including everybody that is letting this go on. And she's of course blaming they for making highly insufficient targets and not meeting those targets. She's already separating, making it very clear who's part of which group. Then I'm going to go back to this. If you look up, you will see, I would say, a beige cluster, and you see GMA. And surprisingly, this was for the week the most retweeted post for that. It's not even related to Greta Thunberg. It's where a TV program where BTS, the Korean band, met with the Korean president. And I just stopped the video. It was a video embedded in the tweet, in the ABC tweet, GMA tweet, and then Greta Thunberg retweeted. But this was the most retweeted post, which says they met, and then I just listened to the video and I stopped my print screen where it says, since BTS represents the younger generation, as many young people relate to them. So it has nothing to do with climate activism. It's just who got visibility over that topic that week. It was a big surprise for us that it was BTS and the Korean president. Okay. So from then we decided, we changed our minds and we said, we're going to filter only her tweets. So and we started noticing that retweeting served for Greta Thunberg to express her perspectives, and also while avoiding some kind of direct self-promotion and bridging other voices to the network. And from June from February 2021 to July 2023, we got 3,252 tweets from Greta Thunberg. From those tweets, 75% are retweets, 16% tweets, 4% reply and quote. I don't know if you want to take a look again. And so reported speech is the act of quoting or paraphrasing someone else's word, and retweeting is obviously the act of sharing someone else's tweet in your timeline. So when you retweet with or without a comment, you are implicitly saying that you find that message relevant in some way to pass on. And any retweet will amplify the original message, even if it's in a negative sense. But if we follow through the thoughts of représentation du discours autre and the dialogic chain, all of our actions online are somehow reporting. Then looking at Greta's actions and engagement, we separated Greta's into what we call ordinary tweets, where she does her Friday for Futures things, when she retweets other actors that she claims are important for the movement or information that she claims is important, and also reactions of support as well as criticism. And then we also separated with extraordinary posts. Am I not on full screen? I'm sorry, just realize it now. Okay, and so she also has extraordinary posts as replies to unusual interactions, such as with Andrew Tate, with Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, where she has a lot of visibility. So in that way, we see that this action as knowing how to serve online communication, getting advantage of that for further visibility. And also events where Greta, for example, is being arrested or going to court in Sweden. These are things that are reposted by legacy media, normal newspapers, and reposted by everyone else, which also is a way to gain more visibility. This is Greta Thunberg's profile. We also think that this is important to understand how to use social media. So how you create your profile is also a tool for improving your visibility. And what she says, how she self-declares, she says, autistic climate justice activism born at 375 particles per, I forgot what the M was. It's carbon particles per million, I think that's it. And it means that the year that she was born, there was so much carbon in the atmosphere, and now it's so much more. And this is a way to represent how climate activists should think. They should think how serious their future is going to be if nothing is done. So when she retweets, she might be endorsing scientists and points of view. She might be curating. She might be amplifying. She might be educating, and also community building. Also bringing awareness and advocacy, and of course, bringing support to others. And who is given space in climate activism discourse via Greta Thunberg? So this is from the collection we did. These are the retweets, and comparing it to 2019, we don't have the retweets. We can see much more that there's more visibility to the global south through via Fridays for Future, where we have a lot of Fridays for Future, different groups, Friday for Future, MAPA, which is most affected peoples and areas. So you have a lot of Friday for Futures, and you have some individual people. And I'm going to show just two of those, who they are. And these retweets, they're not very numerous. They're around 500, maybe 600. So they're not that many, but they keep her always visible. That's what they serve for. It's keeping her visible. She has a steady state of visibility. So this is her Fridays, like I said, it's her ordinary tweet. This is retweeting. She retweets other climate activists from other places. She retweets Scott Duncan, which was here on the right side. Ever since 2019, she retweets him. And he's a meteorologist is in England who talks a lot about how it's getting much hotter in the on Earth. She also retweets a lot of Antonio Guterres. And this is then the word graph that we created from that data set. So here we also have clusters. The green cluster is basically about the climate strike. The blue cluster is more talking about fossil fuel. And the orange cluster down below is more talk about the heating. And the pink one is more talking about energy. So climate is, of course, the central word of the movement. And then we were looking into this, and we saw that there is the word demand twice. I don't know if you see here, demand and demanding. So again, it's another possibility when we have such huge data, what to do with that. So we decided to look, okay, what is demand doing there? And we did the collocation of demand for that corpus. And of course, this is already representing the groups, what climate activists are supposed to do. So we are the climate activists is always we, and demand. Demand is intransitive, but also transitive verb which demands something from someone. And in that sense, what was mostly demanded is action, different kinds of action. So climate action, forceful action, urgent action, and also justice, climate justice. Those were the top demands of this corpus. And then here I have an extraordinary tweet, which was from that whole year and a half, the most retweeted post, which started off with Andrew Tate saying, "Hello, Greta, I have so many cars, so please provide an email address so I can give you my list of my cars and their respective enormous emissions." And then Greta replies, "Yes, please do enlighten me. Email me at smalldeckenergy@getalife.com." And of course, we cannot say when this is going to happen. We cannot predict when such a tweet is going to go viral. But it's one of the key advantages of retweeting is reaching virality. So she goes viral and she never knows who is going to reach, and it's often going beyond.
That's good, I knew I was going to have to, because he messaged me and asked if I could stay on privately.
Erin, excuse me.
Someone's got their microphone on?
Yes.
Who did it? The expert?
The host, the one who invited me to X.
Erin?
What are you speaking about that?
At the end
Erin,
of this thing, when everyone leaves.
could you please switch off your mic?
Okay, so as I was saying, Greta's retweets often go.
No, it's a guy. Grégoire.
Okay, Greta's retweets often go viral, exposing her messages to new audiences, maybe beyond, and her followers. And she is not in control of what will be retweeted, of course. Okay. So challenges and controversies of retweeting and massive posting. There is, of course, as it was said today as well, the risk of disseminating misinformation and diluting the original message too much, because the more we retweet, the further and further away we get from the original message. So it's also very important to check who is speaking and go back to where the message comes from. And my final remarks is that social media are a potent tool to reshape discourses, affecting who is heard and whose voices are marginalized in the digital age. As a prominent environment activist with an obvious centrality, Greta Thunberg has played a significant role in the transformation of the landscape of journalism and the spread of information, as well as setting up a template of what it means to be a young climate activist. It is worth illustrating the vitality of the power of Greta Thunberg's action as a whistleblower in contemporary society, both citing and being widely cited in a legitimized position. So much of what we post is or may be considered reported speech, mainly that it recycles and recontextualizes messages with the risk of disseminating twisted or false information and diluting the original message. And of course, in the dialogic chain, we communicate to inform, to create communities, and we don't do it, sometimes we don't do it on purpose, but we're trying to, of course, protect those closest to us, and maybe to have our own frames of mind around us. Thank you for your attention. This is some of my references. Okay.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for your very interesting.
My time. I'm sorry. All right.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for your very interesting presentation and the different documents you showed during your presentation.
Thank you.
I think there will be a few questions for you. Who wants to start? I could ask.
I can start.
You may start.
Sorry about my mic earlier. Camilla, thank you very much for your presentation. This is less, I suppose, a question about your content, because I thought it was very well articulated, and I don't have loads of questions about that. But I'm curious about how you started the presentation when you said that nobody in your area of Rio had heard of Greta or had heard of climate change. And I wondered to what extent, since you've spent more time there, you've found this to continually be true, and why that kind of discourse hadn't reached that population. I find that rather surprising.
Okay, no, well, first of all, I didn't say Rio, but I am Brazilian, and it's okay.
Sorry.
I live close to Rio, off the coast, also on the coast. And what I meant is that a discourse that is spread, maybe that we see here in the global north, not necessarily reaches the global south in the same way. Back then, when Greta exploded, it didn't reach. So like I said, I have girls, one is older and one is younger. And even in their school, nobody knew about her. And it was shocking for me. And I am a teacher, and other kids didn't know much about her. And when I ask who Greta is, I don't know. What do you know about climate change? I don't know. Now it's different, because now I have been to a couple of Greta's movements here. And there was one that even some Brazilian indigenous people, environmentalists have come. So I believe with her retweeting and also bridging up this communication, I see that other people now know, and the worries are spreading. So we have climate change, we have the consequences, and people seeing it even in places that are not so affected. We see it more often now. And we see now we have people like Greta, similar attitudes from the Amazon, who came here, and they have now their own profile, but they have similar attitudes and similar discourses. We have to protect our future because we are the protectors of the land. Back when she exploded, we hadn't heard of her. And this is also what is very interesting about her, that even though she still has a steady communication, she's able to bridge. And these other environmentalists here, they were from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, here in the ones I've been, they have similar discourses. Okay, we're doing this for our future. We're doing this for our future. So back then when we started, I was wondering why the young people didn't care about it. And I think that has changed. And I think, yes, it has, not only Greta Thunberg, but also other digital climate activists are able to surf this digital communication very well.
Okay, so you think it's, was it more an aspect then of the discourse just not reaching them, or a state of ambivalence? Because I kind of feel that you're saying both, and I can't quite parse which one you mean.
Well, in that time, in 1 year, that's the thing. How come in 1 year a person that is very famous here in the global north was not famous in the global south? But I think she has come through her communication online, and of course because of the consequences of what we see on climate change. And what we see now, even in news, the mainstream media channel is talking about climate change, that before they didn't, because they didn't do that before. So I think she has been a very useful tool in breaching through. I'm not saying that she's the only one, but she has definitely reached what I call Greta's youth. Around that age, she has reached them now.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Camilla.
We have a question from Mathilde, a master student from Aix-en-Provence.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can hear me well. I have a question, but it's more about the, how can I say that? The technical part. And I was curious about how did you generate this, I don't have the word in English, but this clouds with your words, your data?
Yes, it was, we collect this is where my supervisor was going to come and explain better, but I will do my best. So he has a laboratory to collect data, and it's a script, it's a program, and we collect through API Twitter. So we also were a bit desperate when Twitter changed, because I think, I'm not sure if we still can collect from Twitter. So in July was like, oh, let's do this. And then we use Giphy. The Giphy is, I'll write it on the chat, to produce the clouds or the graphs. It's a way of mapping the discourse, and you can choose if you're going to do a term like we did, or if you're going to do with actors. So but he would explain much better than I do. But I know it's Giphy is to produce the clouds.
I understood very well. Thank you very much. I was really curious about the first part of collecting data, because I wasn't quite sure about your timeline and whether it was right before or after the new laws about the collect of data on Twitter and so on. So thank you very much.
Oh yeah, we collected in 2019. Then we collected for that graph when Greta went to United States by boat, and then we collected just when the pandemic's finished, 2019, and then we started seeing from that. And then when Twitter started changing too much, we said let's collect only Greta's history, we call, from February 2021 to July 2023.
Thank you very much.
Is there another question? Oh, yes, Leven has a question in the chat.
Yes, the long twist of functions of retweets. Yes, because when we talk about retweets, we're talking about, there's a part in where I talk about the prefix re. So every time we use re for something, we're taking something from somewhere and recontextualizing, saying re again. So we observed what she does. We go we have a spreadsheet with all the data, and I see which tweets or retweets are very important, have a lot of engagement, and I see what she's doing there. Of course, the functions overlap. If she is endorsing someone, she might also be she's supporting, obviously, but she also might want to amplify that person's voice. So the functions, what we see her doing, of course, I cannot come and put all the tweets here, but we separate and see, okay, here she is calling for a movement that is going to happen next week. Here she is supporting, here she's giving voice, here she's showing how you do it. Here she's showing how many people showed up for a movement. So we categorize what she's doing in the tweets. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, and it has been studied, yes, also by other scholars.
Are there any other questions? Well, I will thank you once again, Camilla, for your brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. So I will try to give you some words to conclude this workshop. Actually, this workshop has just given us a large variety of perspectives about the recent evolution of journalistic work. Social media have had a very strong influence on the alterations of journalistic work and consequently on the journalistic public sphere. I would really like to thank all the speakers for the richness of their exchanges today. Thank you very much. I want also to encourage you to submit your papers for publication. After a double-blind peer reviewing process, these papers will be selected for publication in December 2024 in the open access online journal, IREA. For those of you researchers and academics who have not had talks, you are obviously also welcome to submit articles to newsmedia@sciencesconf.org. I will type the address in the chat. Just before closing this workshop, I also want to give you a brief outlook on the following events in relation to the ISSMDA seminar. On the 9th of November, I will welcome in Aix-en-Provence Erin McInerney as a keynote speaker on the following topic: Playing Parisian, the discursive construction of self and place at Instagram's Café de Flore. This will be a hybrid session, so you will have the possibility to follow it either on-site in Aix-en-Provence or online with Zoom. On the 29th of January, so at the beginning of next year, Alexandre Geffen from the French CNRS will be a keynote speaker on this topic, Intelligence artificielle et recherche en SHS, le cas ChatGPT. Thank you very much to everyone and see you soon.
Thank you, Grégoire. See you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, everyone.